You need to vacate this seat immediately. This isn't where you belong." The click of the officer's radio was louder than the pressurized hiss of the cabin. Officer Garcia's hand rested casually on his holster, a subtle threat that wasn't lost on anyone watching. His eyes skimmed right past the 17-year-old girl in seat 3A as if her existence was merely an inconvenience to be handled. He wasn't speaking to the belligerent passenger who had started the confrontation. He was speaking to her, to Jasmine Reynolds, because she was a black teen in a hoodie sitting in first class. They saw a problem, not a passenger. They didn't know her father was a CEO, and they had no idea the phone call she was about to make wouldn't just get her an apology. It was about to cancel the entire flight. The atmosphere in first-class cabin of Trans-Global Airlines Flight 237 had been one of strained silence just moments earlier. It was the kind of quiet that costs money. The clinking of ice in glasses was muted. The carpeted aisles absorbed the sound of footsteps. Jasmine Reynolds felt the familiar pressure of it all, the weight of belonging in spaces where people assumed she didn't. Flight 237 to London Heathrow was preparing for departure. The engines were already humming with potential energy. Passengers had settled in. And yet here she was, being instructed to leave by an armed officer who hadn't even bothered to ask for her side of the story. At 17, Jasmine Reynolds was already a veteran of these spaces, the first-class lounges, the executive floors, the VIP sections, but she'd never quite grown used to the reflexive second-glance evaluations, the subtle narrowing of eyes, the quick assessment of her clothes, her hair, her right to occupy space. She was flying to London to meet her father, Alexander Reynolds, for the London Tech Summit. Her ticket, which she'd tucked into the pocket of her backpack, read, Reynolds J., Seat 3A, Flight 237, Priority Boarding. It was a ticket that cost more than some people's monthly rent, but it never seemed to buy her peace. She wore what was comfortable for an 8-hour flight high-end athletic leisure pants from Lululemon, a simple black t-shirt and a gray zip-up hoodie from Stanford's engineering program, a program she'd be starting in the fall. Her noise-canceling headphones were draped around her neck, a temporary shield from a world that too often misread her presence. Jasmine's fingers traced the embroidered Stanford logo on her hoodie. Getting into the engineering program had been her proudest achievement to date, not because it was difficult for her academically, but because it represented a space where her mind, not her appearance, would be the measure of her worth. At least that's what she hoped. Breathe. Document. Stay calm. The mantra her father had taught her echoed in her mind. Alexander Reynolds had prepared his daughter for these moments since she was old enough to understand the concept of bias. As the CEO and founder of Quantum Link Technologies, he moved through the world with a power that often shielded him from the most blatant forms of discrimination. But he knew his daughter would face both the challenges of being black in America and the unique scrutiny of being a wealthy black person in traditionally white spaces. At 15, Jasmine had been shopping at a designer boutique in Manhattan when a security guard followed her through every aisle, his walkie-talkie conspicuously raised. At 16, a maitre d' at a Michelin-starred restaurant had asked if she was looking for someone when she arrived alone for a reservation her father had made. Each incident had been a lesson painful, but educational. "These spaces weren't built for us," her father had told her after that restaurant incident, his voice a mixture of anger and resignation. "But that doesn't mean we can't occupy them." He'd taught her the careful balance to stand firm without escalating to document, without confrontation. Jasmine had been excited about this trip, not just because she would see her father, whom she hadn't seen in person for 3 weeks due to his business travel, but because the London Tech Summit represented the future she was working toward, a world of innovation ideas and intellectual respect. Her phone buzzed with a text notification. Alexander Quantum prototype arrived safely in cargo. "Can't wait to see you. This summit will change everything." She smiled. Her father's company was on the verge of unveiling technology that would revolutionize quantum computing. And somewhere in the belly of this plane, secured in specialized containers, was the hardware that would make it possible. O'Hare International Airport's Terminal 5 had been a study in privilege. The first-class lounge where Jasmine had waited for boarding was designed to whisper rather than shout about wealth. Soft leather seating arranged for privacy. Subdued lighting that flattered tired travelers. Staff who remembered preferences and anticipated needs. Jasmine had noticed the slight hesitation when she'd presented her credentials at the lounge entrance, the quick double-check of her name against the system, the glance at her casual attire. But her father's platinum status had granted her immediate access once verified. Still, she felt the subtle message, "You must prove you belong here." The distinction had become more pronounced during boarding. The gate agent, a man with thinning hair and a practiced smile, barely glanced at the documents of the middle-aged white businessman in front of her. A cursory scan, a nod, a "Welcome aboard, sir." When Jasmine stepped up, his eyes performed a full assessment. Hoodie headphones, skin color ticket. The smile remained, but tightened at the edges. Boarding pass and ID. She had held out her phone with the digital boarding pass and her student ID. He scanned it, his eyes flicking from the screen to her face. "Seat 3A. He asked the question carrying an undercurrent of doubt, as if she might have hacked the airline's system. "Yes," Jasmine had replied, her voice clear and controlled. He'd paused, then nodded curtly. "Enjoy your flight." The aircraft itself was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner Transglobal's flagship for transatlantic routes. The first-class cabin featured just 16 pod-like seats, each one a private haven of technology and comfort. Jasmine had boarded early, settled into 3A, and arranged her belongings precisely. The anticipation of seeing her father mingled with the low-grade irritation of the boarding interaction. Quantum Link Technologies wasn't just her father's company. It was the invisible architecture behind dozens of global systems, quantum security for financial transactions, advanced data processing for medical research, specialized logistics solutions for sensitive materials. The company didn't make consumer products. They built the frameworks that allowed other technologies to function securely and efficiently. This transatlantic flight, in fact, was part of a new, massive partnership. Deep in the cargo hold, secured in specialized containers with proprietary cooling systems, were Quantum Link's new quantum computing prototypes. These weren't just expensive, they were revolutionary, utilizing a breakthrough in quantum stability that Alexander Reynolds and his team had achieved after 7 years of research. The London Summit wasn't just another tech conference. It was where Quantum Link would announce a partnership with the European Quantum Initiative, a collaboration that would fundamentally change computing power available for climate modeling, disease research, and financial systems. Alexander had spent months preparing, and Jasmine had contributed to the cooling system design during her pre-college internship. Her name was on one of the patents, an achievement that filled her with quiet pride. As the last passengers boarded, Jasmine watched them with the detached interest of an anthropologist. The first-class cabin filled with its typical demographic, primarily older white men in business attire, a few elegantly dressed older women, one Asian man who appeared to be a tech executive based on his conversation about server farms. She was by at least 20 years the youngest person in the premium cabin. Then came the disruption. A sharp, yapping bark echoed through the cabin. A woman in her mid-50s with aggressively maintained blonde hair and a face tightened by obvious cosmetic procedures struggled down the aisle with a small jewel-encrusted dog carrier. "Sir Reginald absolutely detests this new carpet," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying the practiced projection of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. "It's nothing like the Dreamliner I took to Paris last month." Thomas Wilson, the senior flight attendant, immediately materialized at her side. He was tall, with expertly styled hair and a practiced smile that conveyed both deference and control. "Ms. Hargrove, let's get you and Sir Reginald settled," he said, his voice a soothing tenor. "Right here in 4C. Would you prefer champagne or sparkling water before takeoff? This was Victoria Hargrove, Jasmine realized. She recognized the name from social media wife of hedge fund executive Edward Hargrove, fixture of charity galas, and occasionally trending for various public outbursts at service workers. Her dog, a tiny Pomeranian with a diamond-studded collar, had its own Instagram account with over 200,000 followers. Victoria situated her designer bag in the storage compartment, then the dog carrier under the seat in front of her, all while casting evaluative looks around the cabin. Her gaze eventually landed on Jasmine in 3A. Jasmine, feeling the stare, glanced up from her phone. Victoria offered a tight, disapproving frown before turning away to accept her champagne from Thomas. The message was clear. She had assessed Jasmine and found her wanting. Boarding completed. The cabin door was sealed. Captain Isabella Ramirez's voice came over the intercom, welcoming them aboard Flight 237 to London Heathrow. Jasmine settled in, put her headphones over her ears, and closed her eyes, ready for the journey to her father and their shared triumph at the summit. The plane pushed back from the gate, taxiing toward the runway. Jasmine adjusted herself in the seat, pulling out her phone to switch it to airplane mode. As she moved it from her lap to the small charging port beside the seat, her fingers slipped on the smooth metal case. The phone clattered, slid off the polished console, and disappeared under the partition separating her pod from the aisle. Jasmine sighed. She unbuckled, slid out of her seat, and got on her hands and knees. She could see the phone gleaming just past the metal divider near the foot space of 4C Victoria Hargrove's seat. She reached for it, stretching her arm under the partition. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp, accusatory. Jasmine looked up. Victoria Hargrove was glaring at her, clutching her designer purse to her chest as if it contained state secrets. "I'm sorry," Jasmine explained, her hand still outstretched toward her phone. "I just dropped my phone. It slid under here. Get away from my bag!" Victoria shrieked, her voice piercing through the cabin's ambient noise. "She's trying to steal from me. I saw her. Her hand was right by my purse." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and unbelievable. Jasmine froze, her brain processing what was happening, even as her body remained still, a survival instinct honed through experience. "What? No. My phone is right there." She pointed to the device clearly visible under the partition. "I was just reaching for it." Thief Victoria screamed loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "This girl is trying to rob me. Help security." The cabin, which had been murmuring with pre-flight conversation, fell silent. Every eye in first class swiveled toward the commotion. Jasmine still on her knees in the aisle, and Victoria Hargrove pointing a trembling, jewelry-laden finger at her. Thomas Wilson rushed over from the galley, his face a mask of professional concern that was quickly cracking into something else. Assessment, judgment, decision. "Ms. Hargrove," he said, his voice lowered to a urgent tone. "What's the matter?" "That girl." Victoria's voice was a shrill instrument of panic. "She was trying to steal my purse. Her hand was right there. She unbuckled and crawled over here the second we started moving." Thomas turned to Jasmine. His eyes, no longer professionally bright, were cold and assessing. He saw exactly what Victoria wanted him to see: a young black woman in a hoodie out of her seat on the floor next to a wealthy passenger's belongings. The math in his head was simple, prejudiced, and instant. Miss Thomas said, his voice clipped, addressing Jasmine with none of the warmth he'd shown Victoria. "Please return to your seat immediately." "I was just getting my phone," Jasmine said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline now coursing through her system. "It's right there." "Look." She pointed again to the phone, clearly visible under the partition. Thomas glanced down, saw the phone, but Victoria interrupted before he could process what this meant for her accusation. "She's lying," Victoria insisted. "She was after my wallet. I want her arrested. I don't feel safe with her on this plane." The last part was delivered with a pointed look at Jasmine's hoodie. "She shouldn't even be in this section. This last comment resonated through the cabin. It was the quiet, unspoken question that had hung in the air since Jasmine boarded. Now it had been given voice. Other passengers were beginning to take notice in earnest. Some were visibly uncomfortable. Others wore expressions of suspicion directed at Jasmine. A few had already raised phones, recording discreetly. A white man in his 60s sitting in 5A shook his head, tutting. "Disgraceful," he muttered, loud enough for Jasmine to hear. From the corner of her eye, Jasmine noticed Captain Ramirez standing at the cockpit door, observing the situation with a furrowed brow. But the captain didn't intervene. Not yet. Miss Thomas said, his patience visibly thinning as he blocked Jasmine's path back to her seat. "I need you to show me what you took." "I took nothing," Jasmine said, her frustration finally bleeding into her voice. "I was getting my property. I showed you. It's my phone. She's being belligerent." "Thomas?" Victoria pressed, feeding his agitation. "She's probably on drugs." "Look at her. Get her out of this cabin." Thomas's hand moved to the interphone. "I'm calling security," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. His decision had been made not based on evidence, not based on protocol, but on an assumption about who belonged and who didn't. "Miss, please return to your seat while we sort this out." "Thomas," Wilson said, his tone carrying the artificial patience of someone who had already made up his mind. But his body language told the truth. He was positioned between Jasmine and her seat, effectively blocking her return. "How can I return to my seat when you're blocking me?" Jasmine asked, her voice controlled despite the situation. "And my phone is still there." She pointed again to where her device lay visible under the partition. Thomas glanced at the phone, then at Victoria Hargrove, who was clutching her purse like it contained the crown jewels. His loyalty was clear. "I'll retrieve your phone," he said with obvious reluctance. "But first, I need to check that nothing is missing from Ms. Hargrove's belongings." Jasmine felt her chest tighten. "You want to search me? Based on an accusation that you can see isn't true. My phone is right there. I wasn't near her purse." Victoria's voice rose again. "Check her pockets. Check her hoodie. She could have taken something already." A murmur ran through the first-class cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others watched with undisguised interest entertainment unfolding before their champagne was even finished. From 2 rows back, a woman's voice cut through the tension. "I saw what happened." The speaker was Elena Diaz, a young Hispanic woman in seat 5C. She dropped her phone and was just trying to reach it. "That's all I saw." Thomas barely acknowledged Elena's comment with a terse nod before returning his attention to Jasmine. "Miss, this is a serious accusation. We have procedures that include assuming guilt without evidence." Jasmine interrupted her legal knowledge from prep school debate team surfacing. "Or procedures that involve harassing passengers based on how they look." Thomas's expression hardened. "I'm not harassing anyone. I'm responding to a security concern raised by another passenger." Victoria nodded emphatically. "I know what I saw." From the cockpit doorway, Captain Isabella Ramirez finally spoke. "Thomas, a moment, please." Her voice was calm, but carried undeniable authority. The senior flight attendant hesitated, then stepped toward her, leaning in for a brief, hushed conversation. While they conferred, Jasmine noticed more passengers raising phones discreetly. The incident was being recorded from multiple angles now. She remained standing in the aisle, aware that sitting would look like an admission of guilt, but also conscious that standing could be perceived as aggressive. The delicate balance her father had taught her. Captain Ramirez had been with Transglobal Airlines for 25 years. She had seen this scenario play out before different faces, same script. Her quiet words to Thomas weren't being picked up by the passengers, but they were clear. "Have you verified the accusation? Did you see what happened?" Thomas straightened his posture defensively. "Ms. Hargrove is a platinum member," she said. "That's not what I asked," Ramirez interrupted. "The phone is visible," Did you check before escalating? Before Thomas could respond, Victoria's voice cut through again. Are you going to do something or not? I don't feel safe. This is outrageous. Thomas turned back to Jasmine. Captain Ramirez's concerns evidently outweighed by Victoria's demands. Security has been called. Until they arrive, please stand aside. Jasmine remained composed, though her heart pounded. I'm a ticketed passenger in seat 3A. I have done nothing wrong. I will wait here until someone retrieves my phone, which is right there, proving I was telling the truth. The cabin had become a stage with Jasmine and Thomas as reluctant performers and the other passengers as audience. Some were openly recording now. Elena Diaz had her phone held steady, documenting everything. The older businessman who had muttered disgraceful earlier, Richard Whitman, according to his luggage tag, shook his head again. This wouldn't happen in my day, he said to no one in particular. There used to be standards about who could access premium cabins. From the back of first class, another flight attendant appeared younger with a name tag reading Sophia Martinez. Her eyes took in the scene quickly, and something in her expression suggested she'd seen this play out before. Thomas noticed her arrival. Sophia, please inform security we have a situation in first class. Possible theft attempt. Sophia hesitated, her gaze moving from Thomas to Jasmine to the visible phone under the partition. Is that the passenger's phone? She asked, pointing to the device. That's what she claims, Thomas replied dismissively. It's my phone, Jasmine confirmed. I dropped it and was reaching for it when I was accused of trying to steal. Sophia looked at Victoria, who was now fanning herself with an in-flight magazine, as if experiencing a fainting spell from a Victorian novel. Ma'am, did you actually see her touch your purse? Victoria's eyes narrowed at being questioned. She was right next to it. Her hand was inches away. But did you see her touch it or take anything from it? Sophia pressed. I don't have to wait until I'm robbed to report suspicious behavior, Victoria snapped. This exchange was interrupted by the arrival of Officer Garcia from airport security, his uniform crisp, his expression professionally neutral, until Thomas immediately pulled him aside and began a hushed briefing that involved several glances at Jasmine. Officer Garcia approached Jasmine with the wariness one might reserve for an unpredictable suspect. His hand rested near his holster, not grabbing it, but ensuring everyone noticed its presence. Miss, I need you to step aside for a moment, he said, his voice carrying that particular law enforcement cadence designed to sound reasonable while brooking no argument. I'm a ticketed passenger, Jasmine replied evenly. I was trying to retrieve my dropped phone when I was falsely accused of theft. My phone is right there. She gestured again to the device still visible under the partition. Officer Garcia glanced at the phone, then back to Jasmine. The evidence was clear, but Thomas had already whispered his version of events, and Victoria Hargrove was still performing distress from her seat. The narrative had been established before Garcia even arrived. Let's just step over here and sort this out, Garcia said, gesturing toward the galley area. I'd prefer to retrieve my phone first, Jasmine countered, since it proves I was telling the truth. Garcia's expression hardened slightly at what he perceived as non-compliance. Miss, I'm not asking. From behind Garcia, Captain Ramirez spoke up. Officer, perhaps we should first verify if anything is actually missing. The passenger's phone is clearly visible where she said it would be. Garcia hesitated, caught between protocols. Victoria seized the moment to escalate further. Check her pockets. She could have taken my credit cards, my jewelry. Her voice had reached a pitch designed to carry throughout the cabin. At this, Elena Diaz stood up from her seat. I've been recording since this started, she announced. She never touched that woman's purse. She was reaching for her phone, which is exactly where she said it was. Thomas stepped forward, his professional demeanor slipping further. Recording is not permitted during... Actually, Elena interrupted. Transglobal's policy only prohibits recording of crew members performing safety duties. This isn't a safety duty. It's a false accusation against a passenger. Thomas blinked, surprised at being challenged with his own airline's policy. Before he could respond, Garcia made a decision. "Miss," he addressed Jasmine, "I need to see some ID and your boarding pass." Jasmine reached slowly into her pocket and produced her digital boarding pass and student ID. "My boarding pass for seat 3A and my Stanford ID." Garcia examined them, looking between the documents and Jasmine's face with obvious skepticism. "This is a first-class seat." "Yes," Jasmine replied simply. "How did you pay for this ticket?" The question came not from Garcia but from Thomas, who had no right to ask it. Jasmine met his gaze directly. "That's not a question you ask other passengers, is it?" More murmurs from the cabin. Someone whispered, "She's right. They never ask me that." Victoria was not deterred. She probably stole the ticket too. Or used a stolen credit card. Garcia looked uncomfortable now. The situation was spiraling beyond a simple case of alleged theft. "Ma'am," he addressed Victoria, "have you checked your purse? Is anything missing?" Victoria clutched her bag tighter. "I'm not opening my purse here where she can see what's inside. I want her removed from this flight immediately." Richard Whitman nodded in agreement from his seat. "This is holding up the entire flight. Just remove her and let us depart." The cabin had divided into factions. Some passengers were clearly uncomfortable with what was unfolding. Others seemed to side with Victoria, perhaps out of bias, perhaps out of a desire to simply get the flight underway. A few, like Elena, were openly documenting the situation. Through the window, the lights of O'Hare's evening traffic gleamed against the tarmac. The flight was now 15 minutes delayed from its scheduled departure, a fact the pilot would soon need to address with air traffic control. Jasmine felt the familiar weight of injustice pressing against her chest, but maintained her composure. She had been here before, different setting, same script. The presumption of guilt, the burden of proving innocence, the performance of being cooperative without surrendering dignity. "Officer Garcia," she said, clearly, "I understand you're doing your job. But I am a ticketed passenger who has done nothing wrong. My phone is there." She pointed again. "No one has verified anything is missing because nothing is. This is a false accusation based solely on how I look." Garcia's radio crackled. A voice asked for a status update. He stepped back slightly to respond, keeping his eyes on Jasmine as if she might bolt. Thomas seized this moment to call over another flight attendant. "Prepare the passenger manifest for a possible removal," he said, just loud enough for Jasmine to hear. The message was clear: comply or be ejected. Captain Ramirez had returned to the cockpit briefly but re-emerged, concern evident on her face. The delay was now affecting their departure slot. She approached Garcia. "Officer, we need a resolution here. Our departure window is closing." Garcia nodded. "Ma'am," he addressed Victoria, "I need to know if anything is actually missing from your belongings." Victoria's performance reached new heights. "How would I know what she took? I have so many cards, so many valuable items. Something could easily be missing." "So you haven't checked," Garcia clarified. "I'm telling you, she was trying to steal from me. Isn't that enough?" Victoria's voice trembled with indignation. From the galley, Sofia Martinez appeared with Jasmine's phone in hand. "I retrieved this from under the partition," she said, offering it to Jasmine. "Is this yours?" Jasmine nodded. "Yes, thank you." She took the phone, relief washing over her. At least she had her lifeline back. But Thomas immediately stepped forward. "That doesn't mean she wasn't trying to take something else before we caught her. Caught me doing what exactly?" Jasmine asked, her patience fraying slightly. Reaching for my own property, Garcia's decision was forming. The path of least resistance was clear. Remove the passenger being accused, deal with the fallout later. It happened every day across America's airports. The system wasn't designed to protect Jasmine. It was designed to protect people like Victoria Hargrove from feeling uncomfortable. Miss Garcia said to Jasmine, "I think it would be best if you deplaned and took another flight while we sort this out." The injustice of it hit Jasmine like a physical blow. She had done nothing wrong. There was proof she had done nothing wrong, and yet she was still being asked to leave. On what grounds, she asked, her voice steady, despite the emotion building behind it. Creating a disturbance, Garcia replied, falling back on the catch-all reason used to remove passengers who hadn't actually violated any rules. I didn't create this disturbance, Jasmine said. I was falsely accused while retrieving my property. That's documented by multiple witnesses now recording this interaction. Victoria's voice cut in again. See, she's being difficult. Argumentative. Just remove her. Garcia reached for Jasmine's arm. Miss, I need you to come with me now. Officer Garcia's hand closed around Jasmine's wrist, not violently but with unmistakable authority. The contact crossed a line, transforming the confrontation from verbal to physical. Please don't touch me. Jasmine said, her voice low but firm. I have not consented to physical contact. Garcia's grip loosened slightly, but he didn't release her. You need to comply with instructions. I'm requesting clarification of those instructions. Jasmine replied, the legal phrasing deliberate. Am I being detained? On what specific charge? The question hung in the air. In his 8 years as an airport security officer, Garcia had removed dozens of passengers from flights. Most went quietly, intimidated by the uniform and the threat of escalation. Few had ever questioned the legal basis of their removal with such precision. This isn't a courtroom, Garcia said, sidestepping the question. It's also not a place where you can detain someone without cause, Jasmine countered. From the growing audience of first-class passengers, a new voice joined the conversation. A middle-aged black businessman in seat 7B, who had been silent until now. Young lady is right, he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. You need probable cause for detention, officer. I don't see it here. Garcia's radio crackled again. His supervisor was requesting an update on the situation that was now delaying an international flight. Thomas Wilson stepped forward, attempting to regain control of the situation. Officer, as senior cabin crew, I can confirm this passenger has been disruptive and needs to be removed for the safety and comfort of other passengers. That's not true. Elena Diaz called out her phone, still recording. She's done nothing disruptive. I have the entire interaction recorded. Victoria Hargrove's voice rose again. She was trying to steal my things. That's disruptive. The cabin had become a courtroom of sorts, with passengers taking sides. Richard Whitman from 5A stood up, straightening his expensive suit. Just get her off the plane. Some of us have important meetings in London. Captain Ramirez emerged from the cockpit again, her expression more concerned now. Officer Garcia Thomas, we need resolution immediately. We're about to lose our departure slot. Garcia made his decision. Miss, you need to gather your belongings and come with me now. His tone left no room for negotiation. Jasmine felt a momentary panic rise in her chest. This couldn't be happening. She had done nothing wrong. Her phone was in her hand, proving her story. There were witnesses. And yet the machinery of bias was operating exactly as designed, efficiently removing the person who didn't fit the expected profile. I'd like to make a phone call before I go anywhere, Jasmine said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Garcia hesitated. This isn't an arrest. You don't get a phone call. I'm a minor. Jasmine replied the statement like a chess move. I'm 17. If you're removing me from my flight, I need to contact my parent. This new information caused Garcia to pause. Removing an unaccompanied minor created a different set of protocols and potential liabilities. Thomas looked surprised. Your boarding information doesn't indicate you're an unaccompanied minor. Because I'm 17. Not 7, Jasmine replied. But I'm still legally a minor, and I have the right to contact my father if you're preventing me from traveling on my ticketed flight. Garcia released her wrist, reassessing the situation. Make it quick, he said finally. Jasmine nodded, maintaining her composure. Thank you. She dialed her father's number, acutely aware that everyone in the first-class cabin was watching her. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, Alexander Reynolds answered. Jasmine. Shouldn't you be in the air by now, Dad? She said. Her voice controlled but carrying enough urgency for him to instantly understand something was wrong. I need to put you on speakerphone. You're on speaker, Dad, Jasmine said, holding her phone where Officer Garcia and Thomas Wilson could clearly hear. I'm still on the plane, but I'm being asked to deplane by security because another passenger falsely accused me of trying to steal from her when I was retrieving my dropped phone. There was a brief pause on the line. When Alexander Reynolds spoke, his voice carried the controlled precision of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. I see. Who am I speaking with? Officer Garcia straightened instinctively at the authoritative tone. Officer Miguel Garcia O'Hare, Airport Security. Officer Garcia, this is Alexander Reynolds, Jasmine's father. Can you explain why my daughter is being removed from her flight when you've just said she was retrieving her own property? Garcia shifted uncomfortably. Sir, we're responding to a complaint from another passenger who felt threatened. Felt threatened by what specific action? Alexander interrupted his question, surgical in its precision. The passenger reported that your daughter was attempting to access her personal belongings. And has this been verified? Has anything been reported missing? No, sir. But, so my daughter. A ticketed first-class passenger is being removed from her flight based on an unsubstantiated accusation that has already been disproven by the recovery of her own property. The cabin had fallen silent, all eyes and ears focused on this exchange. Even Victoria Hargrove had momentarily ceased her protestations, perhaps sensing the shift in power dynamics. Thomas Wilson attempted to regain control of the situation. Sir, this is Thomas Wilson, senior flight attendant. Your daughter's behavior has been disruptive to my daughter's behavior, or the behavior of those falsely accusing her. Alexander's voice was razor-sharp. Mr. Wilson is Transglobal Airlines in the habit of removing passengers based on unverified accusations, Thomas bristled. Sir, we take all security concerns seriously, as do I. Mr. Wilson. That's why Quantum Link Technologies has entrusted your airline with transporting not only my daughter, but also $85 million worth of proprietary quantum computing equipment currently secured in your cargo hold for the London Tech Summit. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the cabin. Several passengers straightened in their seats. The name Quantum Link Technologies was recognizable to anyone in the business world. The company had been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine just last month, with Alexander Reynolds described as the architect of tomorrow's computing infrastructure. Captain Ramirez, who had been listening from the periphery, stepped forward immediately. Mr. Reynolds, this is Captain Isabella Ramirez. I was not aware of the nature of the cargo or your daughter's connection to it. Clearly not, Captain Alexander replied. Because if you were, I doubt you would allow your staff to harass her based on an obviously false accusation. Victoria Hargrove's face had paled slightly. The name Reynolds had finally registered. That's Alexander Reynolds, she whispered to no one in particular. Thomas Wilson's professional demeanor cracked further. He knew exactly who Alexander Reynolds was, and more importantly, what Quantum Link's contract meant to Transglobal Airlines. The cargo in the hold represented one of the largest shipping contracts the airline had secured in the past 5 years. Officer Garcia, sensing the dramatic shift in the situation, took a small step back from Jasmine. Mr. Reynolds, we're simply following protocol for passenger complaints. Your protocol includes physical detention without verification of an offense. Interesting. My legal team will be fascinated to review that protocol, Officer Garcia. Garcia's hand moved away from his holster entirely now. Sir, no one is being detained. We were attempting to resolve a passenger dispute. Alexander's voice remained calm but carried undeniable weight. Here's how this dispute will be resolved. My daughter will return to her ticketed seat unharassed for the duration of her flight to London. The passenger who made false accusations can either apologize or be the one to leave the aircraft. Those are the only two acceptable outcomes. Captain Ramirez intervened. Mr. Reynolds, I assure you we'll resolve this appropriately. There's been a misunderstanding. No, Captain. There hasn't been a misunderstanding. There has been a failure of judgment protocol and basic human decency. And now, there will be consequences. The word consequences hung in the air like a blade. I've just sent an email to William Foster, CEO of Transglobal Airlines. Alexander continued the sound of typing audible in the background. He and I were scheduled to play golf next week to discuss the expansion of our cargo contract. That meeting is now canceled. Additionally, I'm instructing my logistics team to halt the loading of quantum link components onto transglobal cargo flights 442 and 515, which are currently being prepared at our facilities in San Francisco and Austin. The implications of this statement weren't lost on anyone in the cabin, least of all Captain Ramirez. Those cargo contracts represented millions in revenue for the airline. Mr. Reynolds, she said urgently, I'm sure we can resolve this without... This was resolved the moment my 17-year-old daughter was physically accosted by a security officer based on a false accusation while your senior flight attendant stood by and endorsed it, Captain. Now we're simply establishing what the cost of that failure will be for Transglobal Airlines. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed completely. Victoria Hargrove sat frozen in her seat, her earlier righteous indignation replaced by dawning horror as she realized who she had targeted. Thomas Wilson's face had lost its color. Officer Garcia looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Alexander continued, his voice now addressing his daughter directly. Jasmine, are you all right? I'm fine, Dad, she replied, her composure maintained despite the situation. Good. Please put Captain Ramirez back on. Ramirez leaned closer to the phone. Yes, Mr. Reynolds. Captain, you have exactly 3 minutes to decide whether this flight departs with my daughter safely in her seat, or whether Transglobal Airlines loses its contract with Quantum Link Technologies effective immediately. I'll hold. The silence that followed Alexander Reynolds' ultimatum was absolute. 3 minutes suddenly seemed like both an eternity and an instant. Captain Ramirez was the first to react, her decades of experience kicking in as she assessed the catastrophic liability unfolding in her first-class cabin. Mr. Wilson, she said to Thomas, her tone leaving no room for argument. Please ensure Ms. Reynolds is comfortably returned to her seat immediately. Officer Garcia. Thank you for your assistance, but I believe we've resolved this misunderstanding. Thomas hesitated, caught between his previous commitment to Victoria Hargrove's version of events and the new reality where Alexander Reynolds, whose company's cargo contracts were worth millions to the airline, was listening on speakerphone. Captain Ms. Hargrove has expressed concerns about return Ms. Reynolds to her seat now, Mr. Wilson. Captain Ramirez's voice cut through his objection like a knife. That's an order. From his seat, Richard Whitman cleared his throat. Now wait, just a minute. Are we really going to let this whole situation be swept under the rug because her daddy is rich? What kind of message does that send? Alexander Reynolds' voice came through the phone speaker, cool and precise. It sends exactly the message I've been trying to convey to my daughter since she was old enough to understand how the world works, Mr. Whitman. Richard supplied, automatically caught off guard by being directly addressed. Richard Whitman. Mr. Whitman. The message is, this power and privilege can either perpetuate injustice or correct it. Today, you're witnessing the latter. My daughter was treated unjustly because she didn't look like she belonged in first class. Now that injustice is being corrected not because I'm rich, but because I have the platform to demand the fair treatment she deserved from the beginning. Richard Whitman blinked, unprepared for this response. Victoria Hargrove, who had been unusually silent during this exchange, finally spoke. Her voice had lost its shrill edge, replaced by a brittle attempt at dignity. There's been a misunderstanding. I thought I saw... You thought you saw exactly what your bias wanted you to see. Ms. Hargrove, Alexander interrupted. A young black woman in casual clothes couldn't possibly belong in your first-class cabin, so she must be there to steal from you. That's not a misunderstanding. That's prejudice, plain and simple. Victoria flinched as if slapped. I never said anything about... You didn't have to say it. You demonstrated it through your actions. And now you're facing the consequences of those actions. Officer Garcia, eager to extract himself from the situation, addressed Captain Ramirez. Captain, if there's no security issue here, I'll be returning to my post. One moment. Officer Garcia Alexander's voice halted him. I'd like confirmation that this incident will be properly documented in your security report, including the fact that no evidence supported Ms. Hargrove's accusation. I'll be requesting a copy of that report. Garcia nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. The report will reflect all relevant facts. Captain Ramirez gestured for Jasmine to return to her seat. Ms. Reynolds, please accept our sincere apologies for this incident. I assure you the remainder of your journey will be without further interruption. Jasmine moved toward her seat, maintaining her composure despite the stares from other passengers. Some looked embarrassed, others curious, a few resentful. Elena Diaz gave her a small nod of solidarity as she passed. Mr. Reynolds. Captain Ramirez continued addressing the phone Jasmine still held. I want to personally assure you that this incident does not reflect TransGlobal's values or standard procedures. If you'll allow me to contact our CEO directly. That won't be necessary, Captain Alexander replied. Mr. Foster is already being briefed by my executive team. I believe he's attempting to reach you through the cockpit communication system right now. As if on cue, a voice came over the intercom. Captain Ramirez, please return to the cockpit for an urgent communication. Ramirez's expression tightened. Mr. Reynolds, if you'll excuse me. Of course, Captain. My daughter will remain on the line with me until this situation is fully resolved. Thomas Wilson, whose professional demeanor had been steadily crumbling throughout the exchange, made one last attempt to salvage his position. Ms. Reynolds, can I offer you anything while we prepare for departure? Perhaps some champagne? Or, no thank you. Mr. Wilson. Jasmine replied evenly as she settled back into seat 3A. Just the respect I was entitled to from the beginning would be sufficient. Victoria Hargrove sat rigidly in her seat, the reality of her situation settling in like a physical weight. She had publicly accused the daughter of Alexander Reynolds, one of the most powerful tech executives in the world, of theft. The accusation had been proven false within minutes. And now that same tech executive was on speakerphone systematically dismantling the social armor she had worn her entire life. Ms. Hargrove Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the cabin, I believe you owe my daughter an apology. Victoria's carefully maintained composure fractured. There was a misunderstanding. I thought an apology doesn't include justifications, Ms. Hargrove. It includes acknowledgement of harm and an expression of regret. The cabin watched in tense silence as Victoria Hargrove, whose social media presence included photos with senators and celebrities whose husband's hedge fund managed billions in assets, struggled to form words that had rarely, if ever, passed her lips. I apologize for the accusation. She finally managed the word stiff and unpracticed. Jasmine nodded once, accepting the apology without enthusiasm, but without further conflict. Thank you. From the cockpit doorway, Captain Ramirez reappeared. Her expression was grave as she approached Thomas. After a brief whispered exchange, Thomas's face lost what little color remained. He nodded stiffly and retreated toward the galley. Ms. Reynolds, Captain Ramirez addressed Jasmine directly. I've just spoken with our CEO. On behalf of TransGlobal Airlines, I extend our deepest apologies for your treatment today. Mr. Wilson will not be continuing on this flight. We're arranging for replacement crew now. A murmur ran through the cabin. A senior flight attendant being removed mid-boarding was unprecedented. Additionally, Ramirez continued, "We understand if you would prefer to take a later flight or a different carrier entirely. Transglobal will of course cover any expenses involved." "I'll complete my journey as planned," Captain Jasmine replied. "I have commitments in London that can't be rescheduled." Alexander's voice came through the speaker again. "Captain, what's the status of the flight now?" "We're securing replacement crew, Mr. Reynolds. The delay should be approximately 45 minutes. And the cargo, has it been verified secure?" "Yes, sir. I've personally confirmed the special cargo remains secured according to protocol. Thank you, Captain." Now regarding Miss Hargrove. Victoria stiffened in her seat, suddenly the focus of attention again. "I believe Transglobal might want to consider whether her presence on this flight is appropriate given her false accusations against another passenger." Captain Ramirez nodded slowly. "Ms. Hargrove, would you come with me, please? We need to discuss options for your travel arrangements." Victoria's eyes widened. "You can't be serious. I have commitments in London too, important meetings." "As did my daughter," Alexander replied. "Before your false accusation nearly derailed them." Victoria Hargrove rose shakily from her seat, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. She clutched her designer handbag, the very one she'd accused Jasmine of trying to steal from, as if it might shield her from what was unfolding. "This is absurd," she whispered, but the conviction had drained from her voice. "Absolutely absurd." Captain Ramirez gestured toward the front galley. "Ms. Hargrove, if you'll come with me." As Victoria moved down the aisle, passengers who had been watching the drama unfold averted their eyes. The woman who had been so eager to be the center of attention now found herself the object of collective embarrassment. How quickly the tables had turned. In the galley away from the main cabin, but not completely private, Captain Ramirez delivered the news. "Ms. Hargrove, Transglobal Airlines will be happy to accommodate you on our next flight to London tomorrow morning. Your expenses for tonight will be covered by the airline, of course. Tomorrow. That's not acceptable. I have a charity gala tonight." Victoria's voice rose again, a reflexive reach for the privilege that had always worked before. "I understand, and I apologize for the inconvenience. However, given the circumstances, this is the arrangement our executive team has approved." "This is discrimination." Victoria declared the irony of her accusation apparently lost on her. Captain Ramirez's expression remained professional, but cooled noticeably. "No, Ms. Hargrove. Discrimination would be making assumptions about a passenger based on their appearance, and then demanding their removal without evidence of wrongdoing. What we're doing is managing a passenger conflict according to our corporate policies on false accusations and disruptive behavior." Victoria's mouth opened then closed. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she found herself without leverage. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Jasmine remained on the phone with her father. Alexander's voice was softer now, meant for his daughter, rather than the audience of the past few minutes. "Are you really okay, Jasmine?" "I'm fine, Dad," she assured him, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the toll the confrontation had taken. "It's not my first time dealing with something like this. Just the first time having backup like you." Alexander was quiet for a moment. "I wish I could have spared you this." "I know. But maybe something good will come from it." Sophia Martinez, the junior flight attendant who had retrieved Jasmine's phone, approached cautiously. "Ms. Reynolds, I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened. It wasn't right." Jasmine offered a small smile. "Thank you for getting my phone. I appreciate that you actually looked at the evidence." Sophia nodded, glancing toward the galley where Thomas had disappeared. "Not everyone here operates on assumptions. Some of us try to see people as individuals." From 2 rows back, Elena Diaz leaned forward. "I have the whole thing recorded, by the way, if you want a copy. That might be helpful." Alexander's voice came through the speaker. "Would you be willing to share your contact information with my assistant? Having an objective record from a third party could be valuable." "Of course," Elena agreed. I'm a law student at Northwestern. I recognize a civil rights violation when I see one. The atmosphere in this cabin had shifted dramatically. Passengers who had been silent during Jasmine's ordeal now seemed eager to express support or distance themselves from Victoria's actions. Richard Whitman, who had sided with Victoria earlier, suddenly became intensely interested in his laptop screen, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Through the windows, activity around the aircraft had increased. A new crew member was boarding, presumably Thomas Wilson's replacement. Ground staff moved with renewed urgency, perhaps aware that this was no ordinary flight delay. Captain Ramirez returned to address the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We're experiencing a crew change and will be departing in approximately 30 minutes. We appreciate your patience." She paused near Jasmine's seat. "Ms. Reynolds, is there anything you need before we depart?" "No, thank you, Captain. I'm fine now." Ramirez nodded, then lowered her voice. "For what it's worth, I should have intervened sooner. That's on me." Jasmine appreciated the captain's honesty. "Thank you for saying that." As Ramirez returned to the cockpit, Victoria emerged from the galley escorted by a ground staff member. Her face was flushed, her movements stiff with suppressed anger or embarrassment, perhaps both. She avoided looking at anyone as she collected her belongings and her dog carrier. Sir Reginald, the Pomeranian, who had witnessed the entire affair from his carrier, gave a single yap as they prepared to exit. The sound, once an announcement of Victoria's importance, now seemed like a sad punctuation to her departure. As Victoria moved toward the exit, she paused briefly near Jasmine's seat. For a moment it seemed she might say something more. Instead, she continued forward, disappearing down the jet bridge from which she had so confidently boarded less than an hour ago. Alexander's voice came through the phone again. "Jasmine, I need to make a few calls before you take off. Are you sure you're okay to continue the flight?" "Yes, Dad. I'll see you in London as planned. I'm proud of you, you know. The way you handled yourself with dignity and intelligence, that's who you are." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. "Thanks, Dad. Call me the moment you land. Okay? And if anything else happens, anything at all, you contact me immediately." "I will." As Jasmine ended the call, she became aware that the dynamics of the first-class cabin had been permanently altered. Passengers who had looked through her before now glanced at her with new awareness. The name Reynolds carried weight, but it was Jasmine's composure throughout the ordeal that had earned their reluctant respect. A new senior flight attendant appeared, her uniform crisp, her smile professional but warm. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm Amanda Porter, your senior cabin attendant for this flight. If you need anything at all during our journey to London, please don't hesitate to ask. Thank you, Amanda." As the replacement crew completed their preparations and the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, nearly an hour behind schedule, Jasmine gazed out the window at the Chicago skyline fading into the distance. The confrontation had been resolved, but its implications were just beginning to unfold. At Trans Global Airlines headquarters in downtown Chicago, the executive floor had erupted into controlled chaos. William Foster, CEO of the airline for the past 7 years, stood at the head of the conference table, his face grim as he addressed the hastily assembled crisis team. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "One of our most valuable cargo clients, who happens to be transporting $85 million worth of technology on our aircraft right now, just threatened to cancel all contracts because his daughter was falsely accused of theft in our first-class cabin. And this accusation was supported by our own senior crew member, Evelyn Nichols." Chief Operating Officer nodded grimly. "That's the situation, Bill. Flight 237 is still on the ground at O'Hare. We've removed Thomas Wilson from the flight and replaced him with Amanda Porter. Victoria Hargrove, the passenger who made the accusation, has also been deplaned. And the Reynolds girl still on board. She's chosen to continue to London." Foster pinched the bridge of his nose. "What's our exposure here?" James Hartley from Legal cleared his throat. "Significant. We're looking at potential civil rights violations, possibly a Title VI complaint since we're a federal contractor. If this goes public, it's already public interrupted. Melissa Chen, head of social media response. She turned her tablet around to show the executives. These videos are starting to circulate. A passenger named Elena Diaz has already uploaded clips to Twitter, 20,000 views in the last 15 minutes. The footage showed Jasmine standing calmly while Officer Garcia grabbed her wrist. It showed Thomas Wilson's dismissive expression as he sided with Victoria Hargrove, despite evidence contradicting her claim. Most damningly, it captured Victoria's comment about Jasmine not belonging in first class, a statement that in context could only be interpreted as racial bias. Foster's expression darkened further. Do we know anything about this, Alexander Reynolds, beyond the obvious? Evelyn slid a tablet toward him. Quantum Link Technologies, valued at approximately $42 billion. Their cargo contracts with us are worth $127 million annually, with the London Tech Summit shipments being the most valuable to date. Reynolds sits on the boards of 3 Fortune 100 companies and has the ear of at least 2 senators. And his daughter, the one we just alienated, Jasmine Reynolds, 17 incoming Stanford engineering student, already holds 2 patents related to quantum cooling systems, considered a prodigy in certain tech circles. Foster stared at the tablet, absorbing the information with growing dismay. So we didn't just antagonize any teenager. We antagonized the teenage daughter of one of our most valuable clients, a girl who happens to be a tech genius in her own right. That about sums it up, Evelyn confirmed. The conference room phone rang. Foster hit the speaker button. This is Foster. Sir, I have Alexander Reynolds on the line for you. The room fell silent. Foster straightened his tie reflexively, a futile gesture given this was a voice call. Put him through. Alexander Reynolds' voice filled the room, measured and precise. Mr. Foster, I understand we have a situation that requires your personal attention. Mr. Reynolds, let me first express my deepest apologies for the treatment your daughter received. It was completely unacceptable and does not reflect the values of Transglobal Airlines. Interesting, Alexander replied, because it seemed to perfectly reflect the values your staff demonstrated in that first-class cabin. Tell me, Mr. Foster, is it standard Transglobal procedure to physically detain teenage passengers based on unverified accusations, or was my daughter singled out for special treatment? Foster winced. There was a serious lapse in judgment by our staff, Mr. Reynolds. The employee in question has been removed from the flight and will face appropriate disciplinary action. Disciplinary action, Alexander repeated. That sounds appropriately vague and inconsequential. I assure you we're taking this very seriously. Are you? Because I'm currently looking at Transglobal's history of passenger removal incidents, and I'm noticing some troubling patterns. Did you know that black passengers are removed from your flights at 8.4 times the rate of white passengers for nonviolent compliance issues? That's significantly higher than the industry average. Foster's eyes widened. He looked at his legal counsel, who appeared equally shocked. I was not aware of that specific statistic, Foster admitted. Perhaps you should be considering you're the CEO. Now, here's what's going to happen. Flight 237 will proceed to London with my daughter on board, treated with the respect and dignity she deserved from the beginning. Upon arrival, your ground staff will ensure the quantum computing prototypes are transferred to our secure vehicles without delay. Absolutely, Mr. Reynolds. We'll make sure I'm not finished, Mr. Foster. Transglobal's exclusive contract for Quantum Link cargo is now under review. I've instructed my logistics team to halt all pending shipments until further notice. That includes the components scheduled for flights 442 and 515, which represent approximately $37 million in hardware. The executives exchanged alarmed glances. Those shipments were significant revenue generators for the airline. Additionally, Alexander continued, I expect a full written report of this incident on my desk within 24 hours, including the names of all staff involved, their actions, and the specific policies they violated. I want to see the security footage, the passenger manifest, and any internal communications regarding the incident." Foster swallowed hard. "Mr. Reynolds, some of that information may be protected by privacy policies. Your privacy concerns didn't seem to prevent your staff from physically accosting my 17-year-old daughter in front of a cabin full of strangers." "Mr. Foster, but if you prefer, my legal team can obtain that information through discovery when we file suit." The threat hung in the air like a guillotine blade. "That won't be necessary," Foster said quickly. "We'll provide the information as requested." "Good. Finally, I want a public statement from TransGlobal acknowledging this incident and outlining the specific steps you'll take to prevent similar occurrences in the future. Not a generic 'we regret the inconvenience' press release, but a substantive commitment to change." Foster looked at his PR director, who was frantically taking notes. "We can prepare something for your review." "No, Mr. Foster. You'll prepare something for public release. I'm not your editor. I'm the father of a young woman your company failed today, and the CEO of a company reconsidering whether TransGlobal deserves our business." "I understand," Foster said, resignation in his voice. "I hope you do. Because what happened today isn't just about one incident or one passenger. It's about a culture that allowed it to happen in the first place." With that, the line went dead. The executive sat in stunned silence for a moment. Foster finally spoke. "How bad is this going to get?" Melissa from social media looked up from her tablet. "It's trending now. Hashtag Jasmine Reynolds and hashtag TransGlobal Racism are picking up momentum. We've got journalists requesting statements." James from legal sighed. "This has class action potential written all over it. If Reynolds pushes, he could force disclosure of our removal statistics, which apparently he already has somehow. That could open the door for others who've experienced similar treatment. The cargo contracts alone represent nearly 4% of our annual revenue," Evelyn added. "If Quantum Link pulls out completely and others follow their lead..." Foster stood up. Decision made. "Draft the statement. Full transparency, full accountability. Pull the data on passenger removals. I want to see those numbers myself, and get me everything we have on Thomas Wilson's employment history. I want to know if there's a pattern we missed or ignored." As the team dispersed to their tasks, Foster remained at the window looking out at the Chicago skyline, where miles away at O'Hare Flight 237 was finally taking off with Jasmine Reynolds safely in Seat 3A. The incident that had begun as a simple accusation in a first-class cabin had escalated into a corporate crisis with potential ramifications across the entire airline industry. And it had all started because a young black woman in a hoodie had been deemed out of place in a premium cabin. By the time Flight 237 reached cruising altitude over the Atlantic, the videos had gone viral. Elena Diaz's initial clips had been joined by footage from other passengers, creating a comprehensive record of the incident from multiple angles. News organizations had picked up the story, framing it with headlines like "Tech CEO's daughter racially profiled in first class and TransGlobal Airlines. Faces backlash over discrimination incident." On social media, the #flying, while black trended alongside #boycott TransGlobal. Corporate watchdog groups were already issuing statements calling for transparency in airline removal policies. Civil rights organizations announced plans to investigate patterns of discrimination in the airline industry. Victoria Hargrove, upon returning to the terminal, had been greeted by the unexpected sight of news cameras. Journalists had somehow gotten wind of the story with remarkable speed, a fact that would later be attributed to Alexander Reynolds's methodical approach to creating accountability. Victoria had attempted to slip away unnoticed, only to hear her name called by a reporter who recognized her from society pages. "Ms. Hargrove, can you comment on the allegations that you falsely accused Jasmine Reynolds of theft?" Victoria had frozen, then quickened her pace, pulling Sir Reginald's carrier close as she hurried toward the exit. Her silence would become part of the story, the woman who had been so vocal in her accusations, suddenly without words when faced with public scrutiny. Meanwhile, in the first-class cabin of Flight 237, Jasmine sat quietly attempting to process what had happened. The adrenaline was finally subsiding, leaving her with the familiar emotional aftermath of such encounters, a mixture of relief, residual anger, and a certain weariness that no 17-year-old should have to carry. Elena Diaz moved from her seat to the now vacant one beside Jasmine. "Hey," she said softly. "I wanted to check if you're really okay." That was intense. Jasmine offered a small smile. "I'm all right. Thank you for recording it. And for speaking up." "I'm just sorry more people didn't speak up sooner," Elena replied. "I've seen this kind of thing happen before, but never quite so blatant. It happens more often than people realize," Jasmine said, usually without the dramatic resolution. "Your dad is pretty impressive," Elena observed. "The way he handled it." Jasmine nodded. "He's had practice and privilege. Not everyone has that backup." As they spoke, Amanda Porter, the replacement senior flight attendant, approached with a tablet in hand. "Ms. Reynolds, I've been asked to provide you with this. It's a secure communication from TransGlobal's executive offices." Jasmine accepted the tablet, reading the message displayed on the screen. "Ms. Reynolds, on behalf of everyone at TransGlobal Airlines, I want to express our deepest apologies for your experience today. What happened was inexcusable and contradicts the values we aspire to uphold. I have personally initiated a comprehensive review of our training protocols and removal policies. Thomas Wilson has been suspended pending investigation, and we are cooperating fully with your father's requests for documentation. If there is anything we can do to make the remainder of your journey more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. Upon your arrival in London, a senior representative will be available to address any further concerns. With sincere regrets, William Foster, CEO, TransGlobal Airlines." Jasmine handed the tablet back to Amanda without comment. The apology was professionally worded, but she knew it wouldn't have existed without her father's intervention. How many other passengers had faced similar treatment without the power to demand accountability? At O'Hare, Officer Garcia was being called into his supervisor's office. The videos circulating online clearly showed him grabbing Jasmine's wrist without cause, an action that violated department protocols for passenger interactions. His supervisor, Captain Rodriguez, was not pleased. "Do you realize what you've done?" Rodriguez demanded, gesturing at his computer screen where one of the videos was paused. "You physically detained a minor without probable cause, on camera, during a situation that was clearly escalated by bias." Garcia shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I was responding to a crew member's request for assistance." The flight attendant indicated. "The flight attendant was wrong," Rodriguez interrupted. "And you failed to independently assess the situation before putting your hands on that young woman. That's not procedure, Garcia. That's lazy policing." "With all due respect, sir, if I questioned every crew member's assessment?" "That is literally your job," Rodriguez said flatly. "To question, to investigate, to verify before taking action. Especially when that action involves physical contact with a passenger who hasn't demonstrated any threatening behavior." Garcia fell silent, the reality of his situation sinking in. Airport security officers operated in a unique space between law enforcement and customer service. Their actions reflected not only on the department, but on the entire airport's reputation for safety and fairness. "You're on administrative leave, pending review," Rodriguez informed him. "And given that the passenger in question is the daughter of Alexander Reynolds, I'd suggest you retain counsel. This isn't going away with a written reprimand." Back on Flight 237, the passengers who had witnessed the incident were still processing what they had seen. Some, like Elena, had actively supported Jasmine. Others had remained silent, uncomfortable, but unwilling to intervene. A few, like Richard Whitman, had sided with Victoria only to find themselves on the wrong side of a rapidly shifting narrative. Richard now sat stiffly in his seat, periodically checking his phone as if expecting bad news. He had recognized too late who Jasmine was and, more importantly, who her father was. As a senior vice president at a financial services firm that occasionally did business with Quantum Link, he was acutely aware that his comments during the incident could have professional repercussions. The video didn't lie. He had been caught on camera muttering about standards and who belongs in premium cabins. In the current climate, such remarks could be career-ending. Meanwhile, in the galley, Amanda Porter was speaking quietly with Sophia Martinez about the incident. "I can't believe Thomas actually tried to have her removed," Amanda said, keeping her voice low. Even without knowing who her father was, the evidence was right there. Sophia nodded grimly. "It wasn't the first time I've seen him do something like this, just the first time it backfired so spectacularly. What do you mean Thomas has a pattern? Certain passengers get extra scrutiny. Others get a pass on behavior that would get anyone else removed. It's subtle unless you're looking for it." Amanda's expression darkened. "Have you reported it?" "Once," Sophia admitted, after he had a young Middle Eastern man removed for suspicious behavior that was actually just anxiety about flying. HR said they'd look into it. Thomas got a verbal warning at most, and I got scheduled for all the least desirable routes for the next 3 months. That's retaliation. That's illegal." Sophia gave a small bitter laugh. "So is discrimination. But it happens every day in this industry." Their conversation was interrupted by Captain Ramirez requesting cabin status. As Amanda returned to her duties, Sophia glanced toward seat 3A where Jasmine sat quietly reading on her tablet. Perhaps Sophia thought things would finally change. It shouldn't take being the daughter of a tech billionaire to be treated with basic dignity, but if that's what finally forced accountability, she would take it. As Flight 237 continued its journey across the Atlantic, the incident that had delayed its departure was spreading across social media news platforms and corporate communications channels. By the time Jasmine Reynolds arrived in London, the story of what had happened in that first-class cabin would be known worldwide, and the consequences were just beginning to unfold. 6 hours into the flight, the first-class cabin had settled into an uneasy rhythm. The initial shock of the confrontation had faded, replaced by a collective awareness that they were all participants in what had become a viral news story. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with careful professionalism, particularly attentive to Jasmine's needs, without being obvious about it. Jasmine had spent most of the flight alternating between working on her tablet and sleeping. She maintained a composed exterior, but the incident had drained her in ways that weren't immediately visible. The constant vigilance required to navigate spaces where her presence was questioned was exhausting, even for someone who had been trained by her father to handle such situations. Elena Diaz had become an unofficial ally, occasionally checking in on Jasmine without being intrusive. As a law student focusing on civil rights, Elena recognized the potential implications of what she had witnessed and recorded. "The videos have over 1 million views now," Elena mentioned quietly as they both worked on their laptops. "My phone hasn't stopped buzzing with notifications." Jasmine nodded. "My father's communications team is monitoring the situation. They've asked me not to make any public statements until we've had a chance to discuss it in London." Smart Elena agreed. "Everything you say now becomes part of the narrative." Richard Whitman, who had been studiously avoiding interaction with anyone since the incident, suddenly appeared beside their row, his expression a strained attempt at collegial concern. "Ms. Reynolds," he began, his voice lowered to avoid being overheard by other passengers, "I wanted to express my regret for any misunderstanding earlier." Jasmine regarded him with calm assessment. "Which misunderstanding would that be, Mr. Whitman?" "Your comment about standards in first class or your suggestion that I should be removed from the flight," despite no evidence of wrongdoing. Richard's carefully composed expression faltered. I simply wanted the flight to depart on schedule. I have important meetings in London." "As do I," Jasmine replied. "Yet you were willing to disrupt my schedule based on an unsubstantiated accusation." Richard glanced around nervously, aware that several passengers were watching this exchange. "Perhaps we could discuss this privately? I'm sure we can come to an understanding that benefits everyone." Elena, who had been silent during this exchange, raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting some kind of arrangement to keep this quiet, Mr. Whitman? Because that ship has sailed. The videos are already public." The color drained from Richard's face. "I'm simply trying to address a regrettable situation like reasonable adults." "I'm 17, Mr. Whitman," Jasmine reminded him with a hint of steel in her voice. "Still, legally a minor. But I appreciate you finally treating me like a person deserving of reasonable conversation rather than a problem to be removed from your sight." Richard's mouth opened, then closed without response. He retreated to his seat, the attempted damage control clearly unsuccessful. As the flight began its initial descent into London, Heathrow, Captain Ramirez's voice came over the intercom with a standard arrival announcement. What wasn't standard was her appearance in the first-class cabin minutes later, making her way directly to Jasmine's seat. "Ms. Reynolds," she said quietly, "I wanted to inform you personally that we've arranged for priority deplaning upon arrival. A member of our executive team will be meeting the flight to ensure the smooth transfer of your father's technology and to address any additional concerns you might have." Jasmine nodded. "Thank you, Captain." Additionally, Ramirez continued, "I've prepared a formal incident report detailing what occurred from my perspective. I'd like to offer you a copy for your records." This was unusual. Captains rarely provided passengers with copies of internal reports. The gesture indicated that Ramirez was establishing her own position separate from the airline's potential liability management. "I appreciate that," Jasmine said, accepting the sealed envelope Ramirez offered. As the captain returned to the cockpit, Amanda Porter began preparing the cabin for landing. Sophia Martinez distributed arrival forms, pausing briefly at Jasmine's seat. "London Customs has been notified to expect you," she said. "You'll be expedited through the diplomatic channel to avoid any press that might be waiting." Jasmine looked up, surprised. "There's press." Sophia nodded grimly. "The story has gained significant traction. Our London office has reported multiple news outlets requesting comment." The reality of what this meant was still sinking in for Jasmine. What had begun as a personal confrontation had transformed into a public narrative about race privilege and corporate accountability. Her private experience was now a news story being dissected by strangers around the world. As the aircraft touched down at Heathrow, passengers began the usual routine of gathering belongings and preparing to deplane. But there was nothing usual about the atmosphere in the cabin. Flight attendants moved with heightened alertness. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. Some, like Richard Whitman, seemed eager to distance themselves from what had happened. Others, like Elena Diaz, were invested in the outcome. "Here's my contact information," Elena said, handing Jasmine a business card. "If you or your father need a witness statement or the original unedited videos, please reach out." "Thank you," Jasmine said, genuinely appreciative. "For everything." When the aircraft reached the gate and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Amanda's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to London Heathrow Airport. Local time is 9:45 a.m. For expedited deplaning, we ask that you remain seated until our first-class passengers have exited. Thank you for your cooperation." This was not the usual announcement which typically invited first-class passengers to deplane at their leisure. The structured approach suggested preparation for something beyond normal arrival procedures. As Jasmine gathered her belongings, she could see through the windows that the jetway was not open to the terminal as usual. Instead, several individuals in suits waited at the aircraft door. One held a sign with the Transglobal logo. Another wore the unmistakable earpiece of executive security. The aircraft door opened and Amanda gestured for Jasmine to proceed first. As she stepped into the jetway, she was met by a distinguished-looking man in his 50s who extended his hand professionally. "Ms. Reynolds, I'm Jonathan Pierce, Executive Vice President of Operations for Transglobal Airlines Europe. On behalf of our entire organization, I want to personally apologize for your experience on Flight 237. We've arranged for direct transfer to your father's vehicle, which is waiting planeside." Jasmine shook his hand briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. What about the quantum prototypes? They need specialized handling." Pierce nodded. "Your father's technical team is already overseeing the cargo transfer. Everything is proceeding according to the original protocols." As they walked through the private channel typically reserved for diplomatic personnel, Pierce continued with what was clearly a prepared statement. "Transglobal takes this incident extremely seriously. We're conducting a comprehensive review of our training procedures and passenger interaction protocols. Mr. Wilson has been suspended pending investigation, and we're fully cooperating with all inquiries regarding this matter." Jasmine listened without comment. The carefully worded response sounded like it had been crafted by the airline's legal and PR teams working in concert, which it undoubtedly had been. At the private exit, a familiar figure waited tall, distinguished with close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair and eyes that immediately softened upon seeing his daughter. Alexander Reynolds stepped forward, embracing Jasmine tightly. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "I'm okay, Dad," Jasmine assured him, though she held on a moment longer than usual. Alexander turned to Pierce, his expression shifting from paternal concern to executive precision. "Mr. Pierce, I trust the cargo transfer is proceeding as specified." "Yes, sir. Your team has full access and oversight." "Good. My daughter and I will be departing now. Your CEO can expect my call this afternoon regarding next steps." Pierce nodded, understanding the implicit message. This conversation was far from over. As they walked to the waiting vehicle, Alexander kept his arm around Jasmine's shoulders. "The hotel has been secured. Press has been blocked. We have time to regroup before the summit." "How bad is it?" Jasmine asked, referring to the public story. "It's significant," Alexander admitted, "but manageable, and potentially transformative if we approach it strategically." As their vehicle pulled away from the terminal, Jasmine caught a glimpse of news vans gathered at the main arrival area. Journalists stood with microphones, likely hoping to catch a statement from anyone who had been on Flight 237. What had happened in that first-class cabin wouldn't end with their arrival in London. In many ways, it was just beginning. Transglobal Airlines' London headquarters was in crisis mode. The executive conference room had been transformed into a war room with staff from legal public relations operations and human resources working in coordinated chaos. Screens displayed news coverage, social media trends, and stock tickers, the latter showing Transglobal shares down 7% and falling as markets opened. William Foster had arrived on a company jet just hours after Flight 237 landed. He stood at the head of the table reviewing the latest situation report with barely contained dismay. The videos have been viewed over 12 million times across platforms, reported Melissa Chen, who had accompanied him from Chicago. The hashtag #transglobal racism is trending globally. We've received inquiries from 67 media outlets requesting statements. Foster pinched the bridge of his nose. And our response so far? "We've issued the preliminary statement you approved," said Derek Hamilton, head of European PR, acknowledging the incident, expressing regret, and committing to a full investigation, but it's being criticized as generic and insufficient. "What about passenger testimonials?" Derek grimaced. "Several passengers from the flight have given interviews. Elena Diaz, the law student who recorded the incident, has become something of a spokesperson. She's articulate, credible, and her footage is damning. Richard Whitman, on the other hand, was approached by Sky News and made comments that haven't helped our position." "What did he say?" "He suggested that the airline was simply following standard security protocols and that the situation was blown out of proportion by social media. He then implied that Reynolds' wealth and influence allowed him to bully the airline. Foster closed his eyes briefly. Fantastic. A passenger is defending our discriminatory practices while accusing the victim's father of bullying. Just what we needed. James Hartley from legal cleared his throat. There's more. We've received formal notification that Jasmine Reynolds is being represented by Lockhart Davis, one of London's top human rights law firms. They're requesting preservation of all evidence related to the incident, including historical data on passenger removals broken down by race, gender, and age. This news sent a ripple through the room. Preservation requests were often precursors to significant legal action. Can we challenge it? Foster asked. James shook his head. Not effectively given the public nature of the incident and the clear documentation. More concerning is their specific request for historical data. They're clearly building a case that this wasn't an isolated incident but part of a pattern. Is it? Foster asked bluntly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Evelyn Nichols spoke up. We've never specifically tracked removal statistics by demographic factors, but a preliminary review suggests disparities that would be difficult to explain without admitting bias in our system. Foster absorbed this with a grim nod. So, we're looking at potential class action exposure. Potentially, James confirmed. And given Reynolds' resources and influence, this could become a landmark case if it proceeds. The door opened and Jonathan Pierce entered, looking haggard after his early morning meeting with the Reynolds family. I've just received word that Alexander Reynolds has declined our request for a private meeting today. His office says he'll speak with you tomorrow after he's had time to consult with his daughter and their legal team. Foster frowned. That's not a good sign. Did they provide any indication of their demands? Nothing specific, but Reynolds' assistant mentioned that he's been in touch with the Department of Transportation and 2 civil rights organizations since landing. The implications were clear. Alexander Reynolds wasn't simply seeking a private settlement, he was building a coalition for broader reform. Foster made a decision. We need to get ahead of this. Derek drafted a more comprehensive statement acknowledging the specific failures in this case. No generalities, no corporate speak. We admit that a valued passenger was profiled based on appearance, that our staff failed to follow evidence-based protocols, and that we're taking concrete steps to address both individual accountability and structural issues. Derek looked surprised at the directive for such transparency. Sir, legal usually advises against such specific admissions. Legal can advise whatever they want. Foster interrupted. But we're facing a public relations catastrophe that's already affecting our stock price and could permanently damage our brand. Sometimes the best legal strategy isn't the best business strategy. He turned to Evelyn. I want a complete audit of our passenger removal incidents for the past 5 years. Demographics, reasons, outcomes, everything. If we have a pattern problem, I want to know exactly what it is before Reynolds' lawyers tell it to a judge. That will take time, Evelyn cautioned. Then start immediately. And suspend Thomas Wilson officially, not just from that flight. Full suspension pending investigation. His actions were indefensible. The team dispersed to their tasks with renewed urgency. Foster remained at the window looking out at London's skyline while contemplating the full ramifications of what had begun in that first-class cabin. Meanwhile, across London at the Savoy Hotel, Alexander Reynolds was holding a different kind of meeting. In a secure suite, he sat with Jasmine, 2 senior executives from Quantum Link, and Catherine Zhang from Lockhart Davis, the human rights firm now representing Jasmine. The airline's initial response has been predictably sanitized, Catherine observed, reviewing TransGlobal's statement on her tablet. Generic expressions of regret without specific acknowledgement of the discriminatory nature of the incident. Alexander nodded. As expected, they're in damage control mode, trying to contain this as a customer service failure rather than a civil rights issue. Jasmine, who had changed and rested since her arrival, spoke up. What exactly are we trying to accomplish here? I don't need financial compensation. Alexander smiled at his daughter with pride. This isn't about money, Jasmine. It's about creating meaningful, verifiable change. TransGlobal's actions reflect broader issues across the airline industry, indeed across many customer service sectors. We have a unique opportunity to establish new standards. Catherine Zhang nodded in agreement. Our preliminary research indicates TransGlobal's practices are not unusual in the industry. What makes this case exceptional is the combination of clear evidence, a sympathetic plaintiff, and the resources to pursue comprehensive reform rather than a quick settlement. What kind of reform are we talking about? Jasmine asked. Structural changes, Alexander explained. Mandatory bias training is a start, but it's often ineffective without accountability measures. We're thinking of something more innovative, a requirement for documentation and independent verification of all passenger removal decisions before they're executed. Catherine elaborated. Similar to body cameras for police, but adapted for the airline context. Recording and accountability systems that create a verifiable record of interactions coupled with real-time oversight for escalation decisions. Jasmine considered this. So what happened to me couldn't happen to someone else without evidence and accountability. Exactly, Alexander confirmed. We're calling it the Jasmine Protocol, and we're going to use TransGlobal's failure as leverage to implement it industry-wide. As the meeting continued, Alexander's phone buzzed with a notification. TransGlobal's stock had fallen 11% since market opening, a loss of over $800 million in market capitalization in a single day. The financial consequences were already significant, but the Reynolds family was looking beyond money to something more lasting, structural reform that would protect future passengers from experiencing what Jasmine had endured. The battle lines were being drawn. TransGlobal was fighting for its reputation and financial stability. The Reynolds family was fighting for accountability and reform, and caught in the middle were the broader questions of who belongs in premium spaces, how bias operates in customer service environments, and what meaningful change looks like in an industry with a history of problematic practices. The next 24 hours would determine whether this incident would end with a private settlement or launch a movement for industry-wide transformation. 1 week after the incident on Flight 237, the situation had evolved from a viral moment to a full-blown corporate and legal crisis. TransGlobal Airlines had issued 3 progressively more substantive statements, each one moving closer to accepting responsibility for what CEO William Foster now publicly acknowledged as a clear instance of discriminatory treatment. The company's stock had stabilized after an initial 14% drop, but investor confidence remained shaky. Several institutional shareholders had requested special briefings on the company's exposure and remediation plans. The board of directors had convened an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. For Victoria Hargrove, the consequences had been swift and personal. Identified in media reports as the passenger who made the false accusation, she had become the face of entitled bias. 3 charity organizations had quietly removed her from their boards. Her carefully curated social media accounts, once showcasing a life of privilege and philanthropy, now overflowed with critical comments. Sir Reginald's Instagram account had lost over 40,000 followers in a week. Her husband's hedge fund had issued a statement distancing itself from her actions. The views and behaviors of individual family members do not reflect the values of Hargrove Capital Partners. The subtext was clear: she had become a liability to the family brand. Thomas Wilson, the senior flight attendant who had supported Victoria's false accusation, had progressed from suspension to termination. TransGlobal's investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents throughout his 15-year career, passengers of color removed or reassigned based on complaints from white passengers with minimal verification of the underlying claims. What had once been dismissed as customer service judgment, calls now appeared as a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Officer Garcia remained on administrative leave while the airport authority conducted its investigation. Body camera footage had confirmed what passenger videos showed he had grabbed Jasmine's wrist without establishing probable cause and had failed to independently verify the accusation before escalating the situation. Meanwhile, Alexander and Jasmine Reynolds had maintained a strategic silence. They had made no public statements, given no interviews, despite multiple requests from major news organizations. Their only public action had been the filing of a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation, alleging violations of federal anti-discrimination laws in public accommodations. Behind the scenes, however, they had been extraordinarily active. Catherine Zhang's legal team had been joined by civil rights attorneys from 3 major organizations. Together, they were building what industry observers described as a landmark case that could reshape airline policies nationwide. On the morning of the 7th day, TransGlobal received the formal settlement proposal from the Reynolds legal team. William Foster read it in his London hotel suite, accompanied only by his general counsel, James Hartley. "This isn't a settlement," Foster said after reviewing the 20-page document. "This is a complete overhaul of our operating procedures." Hartley nodded grimly. "They're not interested in money. They want structural change." The proposal outlined a comprehensive reform package dubbed the Jasmine Protocol. Its key provisions included mandatory body cameras for all senior cabin crew activated during any passenger dispute or potential removal situation, real-time oversight for all removal decisions by a ground-based compliance officer with anti-bias training, comprehensive tracking and quarterly public reporting of passenger removal statistics by demographic factors. Creation of a $70 million fund to compensate passengers who had experienced discriminatory treatment on TransGlobal flights administered by an independent civil rights organization. Mandatory anti-bias training for all customer-facing staff with regular recertification requirements. Revision of passenger removal protocols to require documented evidence before escalation. "Can we possibly implement all this?" Foster asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the demands. Hartley considered the question carefully. "Technically, yes. The technology exists. The training can be developed. The reporting mechanisms can be established. The real question is whether we're willing to be the first airline to admit the problem is serious enough to warrant this level of reform. And if we refuse." "They've made that clear in Section 5, Hartley said, flipping to the relevant page. "They'll pursue a class action lawsuit, seek discovery of all our passenger removal data for the past decade, and request a pattern and practice investigation by the Department of Justice." Foster rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the decision before him. "What's your recommendation, legally speaking?" "Normally, I'd advise fighting this," Hartley admitted. "Standard corporate legal strategy would be to deny, delay, and settle confidentially if necessary. But this is different. Reynolds has the resources to outlast us in court. The evidence is compelling, and perhaps most importantly, the publicity is already damaging our brand in ways that will take years to recover from." "So you're saying we should accept these terms?" "I'm saying that sometimes the best legal strategy is to get ahead of a problem before it becomes catastrophic. If we implement these reforms voluntarily, we position ourselves as leaders rather than defendants. If we fight and lose, we'll end up implementing them anyway, plus paying damages and suffering years of negative publicity." Foster nodded slowly, decision forming. "Set up a meeting with Reynolds. Direct communication, no intermediaries. I want to discuss this face to face." The meeting was arranged for the following morning at Quantum Link's London offices. Foster arrived to find Alexander Reynolds waiting in a minimalist conference room accompanied only by Catherine Zhang. No assistants, no entourage, no press, just the 2 principals and legal counsel, Mr. Reynolds. Foster began after the perfunctory handshakes. "I've reviewed your proposal. It's comprehensive." "It needs to be," Alexander replied simply. "What happened to my daughter wasn't an isolated incident. It was the product of a flawed system. I understand that, and TransGlobal acknowledges the failures that occurred on Flight 237. We've already taken significant steps terminating the employee responsible, revising our training. Those are individual responses to a structural problem, Alexander interrupted. Firing. Thomas Wilson doesn't address why he felt empowered to act as he did in the first place. Training is meaningless without accountability mechanisms. Foster nodded, conceding the point. The body camera requirement would be unprecedented in commercial aviation. There are privacy concerns, union issues, all manageable, Catherine Zhang interjected. Police departments nationwide have implemented similar technology despite initial resistance. The cameras protect everyone involved, passengers from discrimination and crew members from false accusations. The cost of implementation would be substantial. Alexander's expression remained impassive. The cost of not implementing it would be greater. Your choice is simple, Mr. Foster. Be the first airline to acknowledge the problem and lead the solution, or be dragged into it through litigation and regulatory intervention. And if we agree to these terms, Foster asked, what then? Then Transglobal becomes a model for the industry, Alexander said. You transform a potential disaster into a leadership opportunity. The Jasmine Protocol becomes your competitive advantage, a commitment to fairness that distinguishes you from other carriers. Foster considered this perspective. It was a compelling reframing of what he had viewed as a punitive set of demands. There's one more thing, Foster said after a moment. Your proposal doesn't include a confidentiality clause. Typically in these situations, this isn't typical. Alexander cut in. Confidentiality serves your interests, not the public's. The Jasmine Protocol only works as a deterrent and model if it's transparent and public. Foster nodded, having expected this response. I'll need to consult with my board, but speaking personally, I believe we can find a path forward based on these terms. As they concluded the meeting, Foster asked one final question that had been bothering him. Mr. Reynolds, you could have handled this privately. One call to my office before it became public would have resulted in significant compensation and a personal apology. Why take this approach? Alexander met his gaze directly. Because my daughter shouldn't need to be Alexander Reynolds's daughter to be treated with dignity. The next young black person in a hoodie sitting in first class might not have a billionaire father to call. The Jasmine Protocol isn't for Jasmine, it's for them. The following day, Transglobal Airlines issued a joint statement with Quantum Link Technologies announcing the creation of the Jasmine Protocol, described as a groundbreaking initiative to ensure fair and unbiased treatment of all airline passengers through technology, transparency, and accountability. The announcement sent shockwaves through the airline industry. Competitors scrambled to assess the implications. Regulatory agencies expressed support for the voluntary reforms. Civil rights organizations cautiously praised the initiative while reserving judgment on its implementation. For Jasmine Reynolds, watching the press conference from her hotel room, the moment carried mixed emotions. The incident that had begun with a dropped phone had catalyzed a movement for accountability. Her name would be attached to a protocol that might protect countless future travelers from similar experiences. Yet she couldn't help but reflect on the uncomfortable truth at the center of it all. Change had come, not because discrimination was wrong, but because it had happened to the daughter of someone with the power to demand accountability. The system had not recognized her humanity. It had recognized her father's influence. True progress would come when the Jasmine Protocol protected everyone regardless of who their parents were or what power they held. That would be the real measure of success. The London Tech Summit proceeded as planned, with Alexander Reynolds unveiling Quantum Link's revolutionary quantum computing breakthroughs to enthusiastic industry response. The technological achievement, a quantum cooling system that maintained stability at higher temperatures than previously possible, represented a potential paradigm shift in computing power available for climate modeling, medical research, and financial systems. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the headline of the week. Instead, most coverage mentioned the technology alongside the incident on Flight 237 and the resulting Jasmine protocol. The personal and the professional had become inextricably linked in the public narrative. On the final evening of the summit, after the presentations and meetings had concluded, Alexander and Jasmine sat alone in their hotel suite, finally finding a moment of quiet reflection amid the whirlwind of the past 10 days. "How are you really doing with all this?" Alexander asked, setting aside his tablet to give his daughter his full attention. Jasmine considered the question carefully. "It's complicated. I'm glad something positive might come from what happened. But there's a part of me that wishes none of it had happened at all." Alexander nodded in understanding. The spotlight can be uncomfortable, especially when it comes from something painful. It's not just that, Jasmine said, struggling to articulate feelings she'd been processing since the incident. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I wasn't your daughter, if I didn't have you to call. I think about that too." Alexander admitted, his expression somber. "Every time something like this happens, I'm reminded of the responsibility that comes with privilege. Is that why you pushed so hard for the protocol, instead of just accepting an apology and moving on?" "Partly," Alexander said. "But it's also because I've been where you were without the backup. Before Quantum Link, before the success and the influence, I was just another black man being told I didn't belong in spaces I had every right to occupy." He rarely spoke about his early experiences with discrimination, preferring to focus on forward progress rather than past injuries. But tonight, with his daughter, he made an exception. "When I was 26, I was removed from a first-class cabin on a flight from Atlanta to San Francisco. I had the ticket, the boarding pass, everything in order. But a flight attendant decided I didn't look like I belonged there. There was no viral video, no powerful parent to call. Just me trying to maintain my dignity while being escorted off a plane for the crime of existing in the wrong seat." Jasmine listened intently. She had heard fragments of this story before, but never the full account. "What did you do?" she asked. "I filed a complaint that went nowhere. I wrote letters that received form responses. I tried working through the system, and the system failed me." Alexander's voice carried no bitterness, only resolve. "That experience shaped me in ways I'm still understanding. It made me determined to build enough influence that I couldn't be erased or dismissed. And it made me promise myself that if I ever had the power to change the system, I would." So the Jasmine protocol isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been made to feel they don't belong when they have every right to be exactly where they are. It's about creating accountability in spaces where discretion has too often been a cover for discrimination. Jasmine considered this perspective. "I understand why we pushed for the cameras and the oversight, but why make it so public? Why attach my name to it?" Alexander smiled slightly. That was strategic. Names have power. Stories have power. Improving passenger removal protocols is forgettable. The Jasmine protocol is personal. It reminds everyone that behind statistics and policies are real people experiencing real harm. "Do you think it will actually work? Will it change anything?" "Implementation will be the true test," Alexander acknowledged. "But we've designed it with teeth, independent oversight, public reporting, financial incentives for compliance. And most importantly, we've created a model that other companies and industries can adapt." Jasmine nodded, processing this perspective. She had always known her father as a strategic thinker, but seeing him apply that same methodical approach to addressing discrimination gave her a deeper appreciation for how he navigated the world. "I'm proud of how you handled yourself through all of this," Alexander said after a moment. "Your composure, your dignity, your clarity, those can't be taught. You stayed true to yourself in a situation designed to make you doubt your own worth." "I had a good teacher," Jasmine replied with a small smile. "You had good instincts," Alexander corrected. "I just helped you develop them." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the London skyline glittering beyond the windows. Father and daughter united not just by blood, but by shared experience and purpose. "What happens now?" Jasmine finally asked. "With the protocol, with Transglobal, with everything." "Now comes the hard part," Alexander said honestly. "Making sure the changes aren't just on paper. The agreement includes implementation benchmarks, regular audits, public reporting requirements. Catherine's team will monitor compliance, and we'll need to be prepared for resistance, both open and subtle. And what about Victoria Hargrove and Thomas Wilson?" And Officer Garcia Alexander considered the question. "They've faced consequences. Yes. But consequences aren't the same as accountability. Real accountability includes understanding, making amends, and changing behavior. I don't know if they're capable of that journey." Jasmine thought about the faces of those who had questioned her presence, who had assumed the worst about her based on appearance alone. She felt no satisfaction in their public humiliation or professional setbacks, only a weary hope that perhaps they might learn something from the experience. "This isn't the last time something like this will happen," she said, voicing the reality they both understood. "No," Alexander agreed. "It isn't. But maybe next time there will be cameras rolling before the accusation. Maybe next time the crew member will think twice before escalating. Maybe next time someone without our resources will have a little more protection because of what we're doing now." As they prepared for their return to the United States the following day, both father and daughter understood that what had begun as a personal ordeal had transformed into something larger, a potential inflection point in how companies addressed bias and discrimination. The Jasmine Protocol wouldn't solve every problem or heal every wound, but it represented a step toward a world where belonging wasn't determined by appearance, and where accountability wasn't dependent on privilege. That would be their measure of success. The boardroom of Transglobal Airlines headquarters in Chicago had never felt so tense. William Foster sat at the head of the table, flanked by his executive team on one side and legal counsel on the other. Across from them, Alexander and Jasmine Reynolds were accompanied by Catherine Zhang and two representatives from civil rights organizations who had joined their coalition. Between them lay the final draft of the Jasmine Protocol, 42 pages of detailed requirements, implementation timelines, and accountability mechanisms. This wasn't a typical corporate settlement with vague promises and confidentiality clauses. It was a blueprint for fundamental reform. Let's review the core components one final time before signing. Foster said, his voice reflecting the gravity of the moment. First, the accountability measures. He turned to page 3 of the document. Transglobal will equip all senior cabin crew with body cameras to be activated during any passenger dispute or potential removal situation. The footage will be automatically uploaded to a secure server and retained for a minimum of 3 years. Alexander nodded. The cameras are not optional. They're the foundation of the entire protocol. "We understand," Foster acknowledged. "Our technical team has identified appropriate hardware and developed implementation procedures. Initial rollout will begin in 60 days, with complete deployment across our fleet within 6 months." He continued to the next section. "All passenger removal decisions will require approval from a remote compliance director, a specially trained ground-based staff member who will review live footage and documentation before authorizing any removal." "This is critical," Catherine Zhang emphasized. "The current system allows individual crew members to make removal decisions based on subjective assessments, often in emotionally charged situations. The remote compliance director provides objective oversight and creates a verification requirement that disrupts potential bias." Foster nodded, though some of his team still looked uncomfortable with this fundamental shift in procedure. Airlines had historically given considerable discretion to cabin crew in passenger management decisions. The Jasmine Protocol significantly constrained that discretion in favor of accountability. The transparency requirements Foster continued, turning to the next section. TransGlobal will publicly report passenger removal statistics on a quarterly basis, including demographic breakdowns and reasons for removal. These reports will be verified by an independent auditor and published on our website. Without transparency, there's no accountability, Alexander stated simply. The data will either show improvement or it won't. Either way, the public deserves to know. Foster moved to the financial section of the agreement. TransGlobal will establish a $70 million compensation fund for passengers who experience discriminatory treatment on our flights within the past 5 years. The fund will be administered by the National Civil Liberties Alliance with an independent review board evaluating claims. This had been one of the most contentious points in the negotiations. TransGlobal's initial counteroffer had proposed $15 million. The final figure represented a significant victory for the Reynolds team. "We're not just acknowledging current and future accountability," Jasmine spoke up, her voice clear and confident, despite being the youngest person in the room. "We're recognizing that harm has already been done to countless passengers who lacked the resources to challenge their treatment." Foster nodded solemnly. "Agreed. And as we've discussed, the fund will operate with a presumption of validity for claims that meet the established criteria. We won't require burdensome proof from claimants, where our own records confirm the basic facts." He turned to the next section. Training and certification. All customer-facing staff will complete a newly developed anti-bias training program with regular recertification requirements. The program will be developed in consultation with recognized experts in the field and will include scenario-based assessments. "The training must be substantive," Alexander emphasized, "not a checkbox exercise. We've included specific outcome measurements and effectiveness evaluations to ensure real learning takes place." Foster continued through the document addressing policy revisions, implementation timelines, and compliance mechanisms. After nearly an hour of review, they reached the final section: enforcement. TransGlobal agrees to independent monitoring of compliance with the protocol for a period of 5 years, Foster read. The monitoring team will have access to relevant data personnel and operations to verify implementation. Failure to meet benchmarks will trigger escalating penalties up to $500,000 per documented violation. Alexander nodded. Without consequences, commitments are just words on paper. The monitoring provisions ensure accountability beyond the initial media attention. Foster closed the document and looked across the table at Alexander and Jasmine. "This is unprecedented in our industry. You realize that?" "It's necessary," Alexander replied simply. "And it will become the new standard. TransGlobal can either lead that change or be dragged into it through litigation and regulatory intervention." Foster considered this for a moment, then nodded. "We're prepared to move forward. Our board has authorized me to execute this agreement on behalf of TransGlobal Airlines." The signing ceremony was brief but momentous. As Foster, Alexander, and the organizational representatives added their signatures to the document, Jasmine watched with a complex mixture of emotions. What had begun as a personal humiliation was concluding with a structural reform that could protect countless future passengers. After the signing, as the executives and lawyers dispersed to begin implementation planning, Jasmine found herself alone with her father in the boardroom. "It's done," she said quietly. Alexander placed a hand on her shoulder. "No, it's beginning. The real work starts now, making sure they actually implement these changes effectively." Jasmine nodded, understanding that paperwork was only the first step. The true measure of success would be in the lived experiences of passengers in the years to come. "Do you think other airlines will follow suit?" she asked. "They'll have to," Alexander replied with quiet confidence. "Once TransGlobal proves these measures are implementable, regulatory agencies will start asking why others aren't adopting similar protections. Passengers will begin demanding the same accountability from other carriers. The market and the law will drive adoption." As they left the TransGlobal headquarters, neither father nor daughter knew exactly how far the ripples from this agreement would spread. But they had created the possibility for change, not just for those with wealth and influence, but for anyone who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in a space they had every right to occupy. The Jasmine Protocol had been born. 3 months after the signing of the Jasmine Protocol, Transglobal Airlines held a press conference to announce the first phase of implementation. William Foster stood before cameras and journalists, a sleek black body camera prominently displayed on a stand beside him. Today, Transglobal becomes the first major airline to deploy body cameras for senior cabin crew, he announced. This technology, along with our new remote compliance center, represents a fundamental shift in how passenger disputes are managed. Every removal decision will now be recorded, reviewed in real time by trained specialists, and stored for accountability purposes. The cameras themselves were surprisingly unobtrusive, small, lightweight devices that attached to the senior flight attendant's uniform lapel. They activated automatically when the crew member initiated any security protocol or passenger assistance that might escalate to a removal situation. Behind Foster, a large screen displayed the newly constructed Remote Compliance Center, a specialized facility where trained staff monitored live feeds from aircraft worldwide, providing real-time oversight for passenger interactions that reached the threshold for potential removal. We're not just changing technology, Foster continued. We're changing culture. Every customer-facing employee has begun our enhanced training program developed in partnership with leading civil rights organizations and bias experts. This training goes beyond awareness to focus on actionable behaviors and decision-making processes. What Foster didn't mention publicly was the financial impact of these changes. Transglobal's initial implementation costs had exceeded $45 million, with ongoing operational expenses projected at $12 million annually. The compensation fund had already processed over 300 claims, with payments totaling $23 million to date. The stock market had initially punished Transglobal for these expenditures, with shares dropping an additional 5% after the implementation costs were disclosed in quarterly earnings. But a surprising shift had occurred in recent weeks. As passengers began experiencing the new protocols and sharing positive feedback, booking numbers had started to recover. Corporate clients, particularly those with diversity commitments, had begun specifically requesting Transglobal for their business travel. Victoria Hargrove's public fall from grace continued unabated. After weeks of silence, she had attempted to rehabilitate her image with a carefully crafted statement expressing deep regret for any misunderstanding on Flight 237. The non-apology had backfired spectacularly, prompting renewed criticism of her failure to take responsibility. Eventually, facing continued social ostracism, Victoria had engaged a crisis management firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation. Their first recommendation had been a genuine, unqualified apology. Their second had been a substantial donation to the education fund for underrepresented students in STEM that Jasmine had established with a portion of the settlement funds. The donation, $1.2 million, had been announced without fanfare, accompanied by a brief statement acknowledging that actions speak louder than words in the journey toward making amends. Whether this represented genuine growth or strategic image management remained an open question, but the tangible support for deserving students was undeniably positive. Thomas Wilson, the senior flight attendant whose actions had catalyzed the incident, had experienced a different trajectory. After his termination from Transglobal, he had initially attempted to portray himself as a scapegoat, claiming he was simply following established procedures. This narrative collapsed when internal documents revealed a pattern of similar incidents throughout his career, along with multiple unheeded complaints from colleagues about his differential treatment of passengers based on appearance. Unable to secure comparable employment in the airline industry, Wilson had eventually accepted a position with a regional bus company at half his previous salary and without the status and perks he had grown accustomed to. The experience had prompted reflection that his public statements had thus far lacked, though whether this would translate to meaningful personal growth remained to be seen. Officer Garcia had faced disciplinary action, but retained his position after completing enhanced training and community service hours. His union had successfully argued that failures in protocol and training had contributed to his actions. As part of his rehabilitation, he had become involved in developing new guidelines for airport security interactions with passengers, drawing on his experience to identify points where bias could influence decision-making. 6 months after implementation began, the first quarterly data report required under the Jasmine Protocol was released. The statistics were revealing passenger removal incidents had decreased by 67% overall, with the most significant decreases observed among passengers of color. When removals did occur, they were now documented with clear evidence of policy violations, rather than subjective assessments of disruptive behavior. The industry response had evolved from skepticism to cautious adoption. United Airways Transglobal's largest competitor had announced plans to implement its own version of the protocol, though with less rigorous oversight provisions. American Continental had followed suit a month later. Smaller carriers were exploring shared technology solutions that would make implementation more affordable. International carriers had taken notice as well. Emirates Airlines had become the first non-U.S. carrier to adopt similar measures, followed by British Airways and Lufthansa. The International Air Transport Association had formed a working group to develop industry standards based on elements of the Jasmine Protocol. Regulatory bodies had accelerated their own oversight initiatives in response to the protocol's revelations. The Department of Transportation had launched a comprehensive review of passenger removal data across all U.S. carriers, with preliminary findings suggesting industry-wide disparities that warranted closer scrutiny. Congressional hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation had featured testimony from passengers who had experienced treatment similar to Jasmine's, but without the resources to challenge it effectively. In perhaps the most significant development the Federal Aviation Administration had announced, proposed regulations that would mandate elements of the Jasmine Protocol across all commercial carriers operating in the United States. The public comment period had generated unprecedented engagement with over 87,000 submissions, the vast majority supporting the proposed requirements. 9 months after the incident on Flight 237, Alexander and Jasmine Reynolds were invited to address the annual Global Aviation Summit in Geneva, Switzerland. Their presentation, titled Accountability by Design, outlined how technological solutions, combined with procedural reforms, could address persistent bias issues in customer service environments. The Jasmine Protocol isn't just about cameras, Alexander explained to the assembled industry leaders. It's about creating verification points that interrupt the automatic processes where bias often operates undetected. It's about ensuring that consequential decisions receive appropriate scrutiny before they impact someone's dignity and rights. Jasmine, now in her first semester at Stanford, added her perspective. When I was removed from that flight, I wasn't just losing my seat. I was experiencing the culmination of a series of judgments about who belongs in premium spaces and who deserves the benefit of the doubt. Technology alone can't solve that problem, but it can create pauses where better decisions become possible. Their message resonated beyond aviation. Hotels, retail chains, and entertainment venues began exploring similar protocols for high-stakes customer interactions. Technology companies developed specialized solutions for different environments, from body cameras designed for hospitality settings to artificial intelligence systems that could flag potential bias in real-time decision-making. The Jasmine Protocol had evolved from a corporate settlement to an emerging standard for accountability across service industries. And it had all begun with a dropped phone and a false accusation in a first-class cabin. 1 year after the incident on Flight 237, Jasmine Reynolds stood in the departure lounge at San Francisco International Airport preparing to board a transglobal flight to London for spring break. The irony of choosing the same airline wasn't lost on her, but she had specifically requested it. She wanted to see firsthand how the protocol bearing her name was functioning in practice. The past year had been transformative, both personally and publicly. Her first year at Stanford had been intellectually challenging and socially rewarding. She had found her place among fellow engineering students who valued her mind rather than judging her appearance. The incident that had once threatened to define her had instead become a catalyst for work she found deeply meaningful. As boarding began for first class, Jasmine approached the gate. The agent scanned her boarding pass, checked her ID, and smiled. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Reynolds. Have a pleasant flight. No double takes. No skeptical assessments. Just the professional courtesy every passenger deserved." On board, Jasmine settled into seat 3A, a deliberate choice that echoed her position on the fateful flight a year earlier. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Heather Davis, wore a small camera on her lapel, the visible symbol of the Jasmine Protocol in action. "Good afternoon, Ms. Reynolds," Heather greeted her. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" "Just water, please," Jasmine replied. "And actually, I'd be interested to hear about your experience with the protocol changes, if you don't mind." Heather's expression brightened with recognition. "You're that Jasmine Reynolds?" Jasmine nodded with a small smile. "I'd be happy to share," Heather said, gesturing to her camera. "This took some getting used to, but honestly, it's been positive overall. When passengers know they're being recorded, behavior improves on both sides of the interaction. And having the remote compliance team available means I never have to make high-stakes decisions alone." "Have you had to use it for a removal situation?" Jasmine asked. Twice, Heather confirmed. Both times for legitimate policy violations, one passenger who was intoxicated and verbally abusive, another who refused to comply with safety instructions. The difference now is that everything is documented and verified before action is taken. "No more," he said, she said, situations. As they talked, other passengers boarded the first-class cabin. Jasmine noticed the diversity among them. Executives of various backgrounds, an elderly couple, a young South Asian woman in business attire. The subtle glances of assessment that had been so common a year ago seemed less prevalent now. Midway through the flight, a minor dispute arose between two passengers over a reclined seat. Heather approached her camera, automatically activating as she initiated the conflict resolution protocol. Her demeanor remained professional as she mediated the situation, conscious that her actions were being recorded and potentially reviewed. The dispute was resolved without escalation, a small but meaningful example of how the protocol created space for better decision-making. As the aircraft began its descent into London, Jasmine reflected on how much had changed in a year. The Jasmine Protocol had expanded beyond trans-global to become an industry standard. 8 major airlines now used similar systems. The Department of Transportation had incorporated key elements into its regulations governing passenger rights. Technology companies had developed specialized solutions for implementing the protocol's requirements efficiently. More importantly, preliminary data suggested real impact on passenger experiences. Discriminatory removals had decreased significantly across participating airlines. Customer satisfaction scores had improved particularly among travelers of color. Employee surveys indicated that many staff actually preferred the new system, which provided clear guidelines and protection against false accusations. After landing at Heathrow, Jasmine made her way through immigration and collected her luggage. As she exited into the arrival hall, she spotted her father waiting. Alexander Reynolds embraced his daughter warmly. "How was the flight?" he asked as they walked toward the exit. "Uneventful," Jasmine replied with a smile. "Exactly as it should be." Alexander nodded in understanding. Sometimes the most profound change is measured by what doesn't happen. They made their way to the waiting car, discussing plans for their week in London. As they drove toward the city, Alexander's phone buzzed with a notification. The Senate just passed the Fair Travel Act, he announced, reading the message. It includes mandatory implementation of protocol-compliant recording and verification systems for all airlines operating in the United States. "So, it's really happening," Jasmine said quietly. Structural change. Because of you, Alexander replied. Your composure that day, your willingness to stand up for what was right that made all of this possible. Jasmine shook her head slightly. Not just because of me. Because we had the resources and influence to demand change. The real victory will be when everyone receives the same respect and verification regardless of who their parents are or how much power they hold. As they arrived at their hotel, Jasmine noticed a young black woman in a hoodie entering the lobby ahead of them. She walked confidently to the reception desk, presented her reservation, and was welcomed professionally. No sidelong glances, no requests for additional verification, no assumptions about whether she belonged. That more than any policy or protocol represented the change Jasmine had hoped to see. Not special treatment for those with influence, but equal treatment for everyone. The Jasmine protocol couldn't eliminate bias from human hearts and minds, but it could create systems where bias had fewer opportunities to determine outcomes. It could establish verification requirements that interrupted automatic judgments. It could build accountability into processes where discretion had too often served as cover for discrimination. As she followed her father into the hotel, Jasmine felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. What had begun as a humiliating personal ordeal had become a catalyst for meaningful change. Her name would forever be associated with a movement toward accountability and fairness in spaces where those qualities had too often been lacking. That was a legacy worth building. The grand ballroom of the Savoy Hotel glittered with the combined brilliance of crystal chandeliers and technological innovation. The London Tech Summit's closing gala brought together the world's leading minds in quantum computing, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure, a celebration of human ingenuity and future possibility. At the center table, Jasmine Reynolds sat beside her father, watching as the industry's luminaries approached to pay their respects to Alexander Reynolds, and increasingly to her as well. Their recognition was no longer just about being the CEO's daughter, but about her own emerging reputation as both a technological innovator and a catalyst for social change. The cooling system stabilization algorithm was brilliant, said Dr. Eliza Nakamura, head of quantum research at Tokyo Institute of Technology, addressing Jasmine directly. Your contribution to the project was essential to its success. Thank you, Jasmine replied, still adjusting to being acknowledged for her technical contributions rather than the incident that had thrust her into the spotlight. We're already working on the next generation design with even greater efficiency. As Dr. Nakamura moved on, Jasmine noticed a familiar face across the room, Elena Diaz, the law student who had recorded the incident on Flight 237 and spoken up on Jasmine's behalf. She was deep in conversation with the legal counsel for a major tech corporation. Catching Jasmine's eye, Elena excused herself and made her way to their table. I didn't expect to see you here, Jasmine said warmly as they embraced. Life takes unexpected turns, Elena replied with a smile. After everything that happened last year, I refocused my legal studies on technology and civil rights. Now I'm interning with the Digital Accountability Project, working on implementation frameworks for protocol-type systems across industries. That's amazing, Jasmine said sincerely. Your recordings that day made a real difference. Without that documentation, it might have been just another incident dismissed as a misunderstanding. I just did what anyone should do, Elena demurred. You and your father did the hard part, turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. As Elena departed to rejoin her colleagues, Alexander leaned toward his daughter. Ready for our announcement? Jasmine nodded. They had been planning this moment for months, the perfect culmination of the year's developments. The summit director approached the podium, tapping the microphone to gain the room's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, to close our celebration of innovation, please welcome Alexander and Jasmine Reynolds for a special announcement. The room quieted as father and daughter took the stage together. Alexander spoke first, his voice carrying the authoritative presence that had made him a legendary figure in the tech world. 1 year ago, an incident on an airplane revealed what many already knew, that our systems too often fail to protect the dignity and rights of all individuals equally. The Jasmine Protocol emerged from that moment as a template for accountability in customer service environments. He gestured to his daughter, yielding the microphone. This was her moment now. Today, we're proud to announce the establishment of the Accountability Technology Initiative. Jasmine said, her voice clear and confident. With initial funding of $120 million from Quantum Link Technologies and partner organizations, ATI will develop open-source solutions for implementing protocol-type systems across industries from hospitality to healthcare, retail to public transportation. She continued describing the technical specifications, implementation frameworks, and training modules that would be freely available to any organization committed to building accountability into their operations. The announcement represented a significant expansion of the protocol beyond airlines to potentially any customer-facing industry. After the formal presentation concluded and the applause faded, Jasmine and Alexander found a quiet moment alone on the hotel's terrace overlooking the Thames. The London skyline glittered against the night sky, a fitting backdrop for reflection. "You've come so far in a year," Alexander said quietly. "From that call on the airplane to announcing a global initiative. I'm incredibly proud of you." "I had help," Jasmine replied. "From you, from Elena, from everyone who recognized that what happened wasn't just about me." "That's true," Alexander acknowledged. "But it was your composure in that moment, your dignity when faced with indignity, that created the possibility for everything that followed." Jasmine was quiet for a moment, reflecting on the journey from that first-class cabin to this moment. "I still think about her sometimes," she admitted. "Victoria Hargrove. I wonder if she's learned anything from all this." "People can change," Alexander said. "But it usually requires seeing themselves clearly first. That's the hardest part." "And Thomas Wilson, Officer Garcia. I wonder where they are now." "Garcia is actually working with the Accountability Initiative through the Airport Authority," Alexander informed her. "His perspective as someone who made the wrong call has been valuable in designing better protocols. Wilson, from what I've heard, is still struggling to accept his role in what happened." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. "I don't want them to suffer forever. I just want the system to change so it doesn't keep happening to others." Alexander smiled at his daughter's compassion. Even after everything, she hadn't lost sight of the larger purpose, not revenge or punishment, but transformation and growth. "Tomorrow's flight home," he said, changing the subject. "Same airline, same route." "Are you nervous?" Jasmine considered the question. "No," she decided. "Not nervous. Hopeful. I want to see if things have really changed, if the protocol has made a difference beyond the public statements and press releases." "That's the true test," Alexander agreed. "Not policies on paper, but experiences in practice." As they stood together overlooking the city, father and daughter shared a moment of quiet accomplishment. They had transformed a painful experience into a catalyst for change, a personal humiliation into a public good. Tomorrow's flight would be one measure of that change. But the real legacy of the Jasmine Protocol would be written in thousands of interactions that never escalated to confrontation in dignity, preserved rather than dignity violated in belonging, affirmed rather than belonging questioned. Some victories were measured not by what happened, but by what didn't happen anymore. The implementation of the Jasmine Protocol across the airline industry had yielded measurable results within its first year. Passenger removal incidents had decreased by 62% industry-wide among participating carriers. More significantly, the racial disparity in removal rates had narrowed dramatically, from black passengers being removed at 8.4 times the rate of white passengers to just 1.7 times, still imperfect, but a substantial improvement. The body camera requirement initially met with resistance from airline unions concerned about privacy and constant surveillance, had ultimately gained acceptance, as data showed it protected crew members as much as passengers. False accusations against staff had decreased by 41%, with video evidence quickly resolving disputes that might previously have escalated to formal complaints. The remote compliance centers, now operating at 8 major airlines, had become sophisticated operations, employing specially trained staff who provided real-time oversight for potential removal situations. Their verification requirement created a crucial pause in the escalation process, a moment for evidence-based assessment rather than reactive decision-making. For Thomas Wilson, the aftermath had been challenging. Unable to secure comparable employment in the airline industry, he had eventually accepted a position with a regional transportation company at a significantly reduced salary. His attempts to portray himself as merely following protocol had failed when internal reviews revealed a pattern of differential treatment throughout his career. In a surprising development 6 months after his termination, Wilson had contacted Catherine Zhang, the attorney who had represented the Reynolds family. After several conversations, he had agreed to participate in training videos for the Accountability Technology Initiative, sharing his perspective on how implicit bias had influenced his decision-making without his conscious awareness. "I didn't think of myself as biased," he acknowledged in one particularly powerful segment. "I thought I was doing my job following security protocols. But when I was forced to review the pattern of my decisions over 15 years, I couldn't ignore the evidence. I treated passengers differently based on appearance, and I never questioned why." His testimony had become a valuable tool in training programs demonstrating how even those who considered themselves fair could perpetuate discriminatory patterns without realizing it. Victoria Hargrove had taken a different path. After her initial non-apology backfired, she had retreated from public view for several months. When she re-emerged, it was with a dramatically different approach, a substantial donation to the STEM education fund Jasmine had established, followed by genuine engagement with bias awareness programs. Whether motivated by sincere growth or strategic image rehabilitation remained open to interpretation, but her actions had concrete, positive impacts. Her social standing, once defined by charity galas and designer accessories, was slowly being rebuilt around substantive contributions to meaningful causes. Officer Garcia had faced disciplinary action, but retained his position after completing enhanced training. His union had successfully argued that inadequate protocols and training had contributed to his actions as much as personal judgment. As part of his rehabilitation, he had become involved in developing new guidelines for airport security interactions with passengers, drawing on his experience to identify potential points of bias in standard procedures. The compensation fund established under the protocol had processed over 200 claims in its first year, distributing approximately $42 million to passengers who had experienced discriminatory treatment on transglobal flights. Their stories, anonymized and compiled, had become powerful evidence of the need for structural change beyond individual airlines. Corporate response to the protocol had evolved from resistance to strategic adoption. Airlines that initially viewed the requirements as burdensome regulations had begun promoting their compliance as a competitive advantage. Protocol Certified had become a designation that companies advertised prominently, recognizing that consumers increasingly factored ethical considerations into their purchasing decisions. The technology industry had responded with innovative solutions for implementing protocol requirements efficiently. Specialized body cameras designed for service environments, secure storage systems for compliance documentation, and artificial intelligence tools for identifying potential bias in decision patterns had created a new market segment focused on accountability technology. Educational institutions had incorporated the Jasmine Protocol case study into curricula ranging from business ethics to engineering design to legal studies. Stanford's technology ethics program now included a required module on building accountability into systems where human discretion could be influenced by bias. Perhaps most significantly, the protocol had sparked conversations about accountability and bias in spaces far beyond airlines. Hotels had begun implementing similar verification requirements for guest removal decisions. Retail chains were exploring how the principles could apply to security protocols. Healthcare facilities were developing accountability measures for patient interaction procedures. The Jasmine Protocol had become more than a set of policies for a single industry. It had evolved into a framework for thinking about how technology procedure and human judgment could be aligned to protect dignity and ensure fairness. Its impact would continue to grow as organizations across sectors recognized that accountability wasn't just an ethical imperative, it was good business. The sun streamed through the first-class cabin windows as Flight 237 from London to San Francisco reached cruising altitude. Jasmine Reynolds settled into Seat 3A, the same designation she had occupied during the incident that had changed the trajectory of her life a year earlier. This time, however, the experience was fundamentally different. The senior flight attendant, whose camera had discreetly recorded their initial interaction, had welcomed her professionally. Her fellow passengers had shown no particular interest in her presence. She was simply another traveler in the cabin, neither questioned nor scrutinized. As Jasmine opened her tablet to review notes from the London Tech Summit, a message notification appeared from her father. Alexander had taken an earlier flight to prepare for a board meeting in New York. "How's the flight?" he had written. "Wonderfully uneventful," she replied. "Exactly as it should be." That simple exchange captured the essence of what they had worked to achieve. The best outcome wasn't special treatment or extraordinary accommodation. It was ordinary respect consistently applied regardless of appearance, background, or circumstance. The Jasmine Protocol couldn't eliminate bias from human hearts and minds. That remained a deeper, longer journey for society. But it could create systems where bias had fewer opportunities to determine outcomes. It could establish verification requirements that interrupted automatic judgments. It could build accountability into processes where discretion had too often served as cover for discrimination. As the flight continued over the Atlantic, Jasmine reflected on the lessons of the past year. Change required both personal courage and structural reform. Individual dignity mattered, but so did collective responsibility. Technology could enhance accountability, but only if designed with human values at its core. Most importantly, she had learned that privilege carried responsibility. Her father's influence had enabled them to demand change that others couldn't. But the true measure of that privilege wasn't in protecting themselves. It was in extending protection to everyone, especially those without wealth connections or power. The seat indicator chimed softly, indicating they had reached 30,000 feet. Jasmine gazed out the window at the vast ocean below, thinking about all the passengers on all the flights crossing the skies at that very moment. How many would experience the dignity and respect she now did? How many still faced the suspicion and scrutiny she had encountered a year ago? The Jasmine Protocol was just one step toward answering those questions. A significant step, but still just the beginning of a longer journey toward spaces where belonging wasn't determined by appearance and accountability wasn't dependent on privilege. As the flight attendant approached to offer refreshments, Jasmine noticed the small camera on her lapel, the visible symbol of that journey. Not a perfect solution, but a meaningful start. The technology created a pause in the escalation process, a moment for evidence to supersede assumption, for verification to precede action. In that pause lay the possibility of justice, not just for those with power, but for everyone. The story of the Jasmine Protocol would continue to unfold in airports and aircraft around the world, in training sessions and policy meetings, in technology development and implementation strategies. But its essence would always remain simple dignity, deserved protection, accountability, required verification, and belonging should never depend on appearance. That was a legacy worth building one flight at a time. If you've ever felt judged based on your appearance or questioned about whether you belong somewhere, this story probably resonated with you. The journey from discrimination to real meaningful change isn't just fiction. It's something we can all work toward in our everyday lives. Did Jasmine's story touch something in you? Have you witnessed or experienced similar situations where people were treated differently based on how they looked? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found value in this story about standing up against injustice with dignity and creating lasting change, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Each subscription helps us bring more of these powerful stories to light. Remember, change begins with awareness, but it doesn't end there. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is document, speak up, and demand better systems, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who might face the same challenges without the resources to fight back. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember that dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right.